check. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning or afternoon and welcome. Is this mic hot? Can you hear me? Got a thumbs up there, got a yes in chat. Wonderful. So good day to you. Welcome. It's great to have you with us here today. We're going to be talking about risk management and good security governance here today in our presentation, in our webinar seminar here for mastering security and risk management. So without any further ado, if you can hear me, I say why not get started. Some basic Zoom etiquette guidelines, as it were, and it looks like lots of folks here have got this already going. So good on you. Thank you so much. Hey, mute the mics when they're not in use. Helps cut out that distracting background noises, dog barking, car driving by, all that kind of stuff. Zoom's pretty good at filtering most of that, but hardly perfect at it. So, hey, we'll just keep the mics muted when we're not using them. And then simply, hey, unmute as needed. Easy enough, right? Chat will be available and is an option here if the microphone isn't an option for you. And monitor off to the side of watch chat here. So always an option there. All right, so as we said, today's webinar is about security and risk management, and our duration is about 2.5 to 3 hours. You know, because I'm going to leave some room in there for discussions and questions, and we'll see where it takes us. We've broken today up into some sections. Our very first section here today, our first module, will be the principles of security management, a sort of look into good governance and some suggestions about maybe how to approach that, how to look at that. And of course, this will all be in keeping with ISC 2, or formerly as we call them, ISC squared's approach, you know, to management. So for those who might be preparing for a CISSP or looking to use this, you know, webinar today as a form of like credits, you know, continuing education credits or units, you know, thereby, well, that'll totally be possible. So we're going to keep this in line with, you know, ISC 2's perception of all this, but also add in some additional insights that might be of some use. And after we're done talking about like governance and the importance of policies, we'll talk a little bit about risk management here. We're going to talk about the difference between quantitative and qualitative approaches. We're going to talk about ways to find new threats. How do you find a threat in a business place today? We'll look into some of that. We'll talk about the importance of threat intelligence. At the tail end of that, we'll talk about transference and mitigation and some of the pitfalls that are tied to those that are not always so obvious. Like the type of challenges and problems that you only really get through years of doing it, you know. We'll talk about a couple of those pro tips. In our third section here, we're going to talk about ethics. We're going to take a deep dive into ISC 2's approach to ethics, how they look at ethics, and we'll talk a little bit about the legal landscape that we're dealing with today. You know, what type of challenges are out there. Mostly we'll be just highlighting that there's sort of a lot of different like legal conundrums depending on what type of landscape or business industry you're part of. And we'll touch on some like key vocabulary tied to those. But we're definitely going to try and elevate everybody's recognition of the challenges that are out there by the end of that. We'll talk about business continuity in our very last sort of module here. Business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning, with some additional notes about how to properly test these plans, get feedback on these plans, what are the important metrics tied to these plans, and maybe some of the things that are not so obvious about like how to do an impact analysis, you know, how to properly look at a business's like assets and the values of said assets, which will overlap a little bit with concepts of risk management in that second module. So 4 little modules here today. And once we've got those covered and we've talked out those points, we'll be ready to discuss a couple case studies. I picked a couple interesting ones, pretty famous ones, the SolarWinds one and the one with the oil pipeline / gas pipeline that got targeted by ransomware a few years back. Talk about how those things happen, and how better governance and maybe some good defenses could have completely stopped some amount of the impact, if not the entire attack. And we'll analyze those situations and discuss them out. Then there at the very, very end, I'm going to summarize some of our key takeaways from today's discussions, from today's presentation, really tenets that we can take to heart here that'll make us better managers. And again, if we're preparing for like CISSP, really good tenets to live by when approaching that exam. I'll also open the floor then to any questions you may have about test prep or really anything at all. Because why not? Why not? So yeah, well, there's the plan. This should take us about 2.5 to 3 hours. We'll take a little break there, probably a little 5 to 10 minute break here between module 2 and 3, as that seems like a nice spot to maybe refresh a drink or use the restroom. A little stop to see the sights along the way. But cool, that's what we're looking at here for today. I will be presenting this, of course. My name is Matthew Wagner. It is a pleasure to have you with me here today. You can see some of my credentials there. I've been in the industry for a couple decades now, doing all sorts of things. Sometimes you wear many different hats when you're in the IT industry. I've designed networks, I've designed systems, I've deployed cameras. I've been all over the place, and I've even managed some security for organizations, up to and involving myself in some audits on more than a couple occasions. But then along the line, somewhere in there down that path, I said, you know what I really like doing? I like traveling and meeting new people and going to the same data center or to the same office, for the most part. Doesn't necessarily facilitate that as well as I would like. Being an instructor slash providing, services like that of today have brought me all over the planet, which has allowed me to help people on their journey and traveled interesting places. And I couldn't be happier about that. So great to have you with us here today. This is what we're looking at. And without any further ado, I say then, let's go ahead and get started. For those just joining us, welcome. It's a great day and it's great to have you with us. We're about to get started here with module number 1. The principles of security management. All right, our goals within this topic are to explore security governance. What is governance? What does it mean? Why is it important? There's certainly been occasions where it's like, stupid managers, but like that's a necessary part of a healthy business. We need something to guide the business. How are we going to do that? What are some of the pitfalls of it? We're going to investigate that. We're going to talk about how policies factor into that overall process. We'll also touch on how role-based security can factor into this and help streamline some amount of it. We're also going to talk about, at the tail end of it, the importance of data classification. Like, why is that necessary? And how does that help us, provide governance? So we'll analyze that a little bit. We'll also talk about some control frameworks and standards. Boy, there's so many frameworks, there's so many standards, but we'll mention a few of them, as I think frameworks and standards are a lot like having the right tool in your tool bag. You don't have to have that screwdriver in your hand all the time. You don't always have to be following every single framework, but they're out there. You got those tools in the bag. Someday you might need it, so having the right framework, the right tool for the right job makes all the difference. And I want to just heighten some awareness of what frameworks are out there. So you got those tools, you can reach into that tool bag, grab the exact screwdriver, for the exact task at hand. So that's what we're going to be looking at here. All right, let's get started. Governance, okay? Governance. It's about making rules. It's about making policies, rules and policies. These rules, these policies are going to help manage our organization, and, as it evolves, as all good organizations do. Famously, someone once said to me, a CEO once said to me, Matt, I think about it every day. If we're not growing, we're dying. I was like, you think about that every day? He says, yeah. He says, I'm always looking for new opportunities and new ways to expand the business. Or if you're not, someone else is going to find a way, and they're going to find that new thing. They're going to find that new business opportunity and they're going to put us out of business with their grandiose success. We've got to be in a position to find those new innovations and be even evolving our pre-existing business processes. So we're always trying to move forward, alongside the technology. If we're not growing, we're dying. I thought to myself, that's a bunch of nonsense. Years later, I thought, you know what? That's actually very insightful. It's actually absolutely right. If we're not getting ahead of it, or at least we're not trying to keep up, we're going to fall way behind. And this world has no mercy for those who, or especially businesses that fall behind. So, hey, we're going to make some policies. They're going to help give us some structure as we're growing, but they're also going to help guide us to our goals. A business has got to know what its goals are. They got to know where they're going or what they're trying to achieve, um, or else I don't know what the point of it is. Obviously the point might be just say make money, but improve stockholder value, some stuff like that. Sure, but it's not just the money, and there are smaller goals than just that, getting a product to market and things like that. So, all right, as an organization evolves, and as we try to guide it towards achieving its goals, our policies are going to help with that, give us some structure. They're also going to help us determine who's going to be accountable for certain things. And especially in the realm of security, this is critical. No, absolutely critical. If we do not, assign something to someone, if we don't tell somebody, hey, I need you to set up blank, chances are they won't. And certainly we don't want to leave things to chance. We want to make sure things get done. We want people to have responsibilities and we want to be able to hold them to that. We want them to be accountable for certain things getting done. And in the realm of security, making somebody accountable for deploying that firewall is pretty important. It's not going to happen unless we assign it to somebody. So determining who's going to be held accountable for certain systems, determining who's supposed to be handling the patch management, determining who's supposed to be handling this or that, can all be outlined in the policies. By assigning that accountability and or responsibility to someone, we have a better chance of stuff getting done. We want to foster trust with customers, partners, and suppliers. In fact, there's this whole process, CMMI, the Capability Maturity Model Index. It's a way of measuring a business. It started as a way of measuring a software development team, but has evolved well beyond that to measure a business and see what level are they out of 5 different levels when it comes to good management. Businesses like to see higher levels of CMMI. They don't want to see level 1, the initial level, where policies are word of mouth and made retroactively, more often than not. They want to see things being made proactively and put in writing. They want us to be working towards CMMI level 5 optimizing, where we've already written everything. Now we're just trying to perfect it, but all in all, the better display of governance, the more clear the policies and the more developed the policies are, and basing them off of well-known standards will make our customers, our partners, and our suppliers feel better about our business. And perception is important to, making good business happen. It's going to help foster those goals. We also want to make processes and so forth in the business, repeatable, predictable, and sustainable. And policies help drive that. Now, you might think, well, making something repeatable, it sounds like a procedure. And I'd say, well, you're not wrong. Procedure are step-by-step instructions, here's how to do something step by step by step. But ultimately speaking, procedures don't appear in a vacuum. They don't just appear out of nowhere. Procedures are born from a good policy. A policy will dictate the need for procedures to be created and guide the creation of the procedure itself. So thereby, it seems like governance, good management, the creation of standards and policy, or standards, procedures, and guidelines and so forth, all starts at least with some amount of policy being created, those rules. Who's going to make those rules, though? Okay. Who's going to make those rules? Who should be making those rules? Do we want to take a bottom-up approach? Do we want to take a top-down approach? I think we want to go top-down. Good governance should come from the top. Now, that's not to say that we don't care about, the janitor's opinion. Oh, certainly we do. Good managers should care about everybody's opinion within the organization and business partners and so forth. They should be taking input, taking data, collating that data from as many sources as possible, getting input from the brightest minds from top to bottom. But in the end, we need somebody to make the decision, and that needs to be the person at the top. You see, the people at the top, they know what the business's goals are. Hell, they were hired by the board of directors to make those goals happen. They understand the long-term trajectory for the business, the overall strategy. And if they don't, well, they need to develop one. But they have that understanding and that big bird's eye view, that you don't get at the bottom. They also have the money, the authority, the ability to finance, security, which ain't free. It's not free. Wish it was. So setting up good security and enforcing security takes time. Time is money. You need somebody with the money to help make that happen. Thereby, good governance needs to come from the top. So upper management is going to determine the overall security strategy for our organization, and this should be in keeping with our business's goals. This does bring up an interesting point that I would hope everybody says, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. But sometimes, every now and then, somebody goes, I never thought that. Ding, light bulb. Thereby, it feels like it might be worth saying. Security is not there for security's sake. Security is there to help a business thrive. It's there to help the business reach those goals. So when we develop a security strategy, when we're thinking about how we're going to apply security to a business, we got to remember that that's only there to help us achieve those goals and never to support itself. Thereby, in a sense, the security should honestly be saving us money in the end. If done properly, it makes us money. With that then said, the policies written by management will help and reflect and enforce the overall security strategy that, upper management with their bird's eye view thinks is most appropriate for achieving those goals. Now, of course, you got to consider the culture of where you're working. You can't ignore that. How businesses, view security, perhaps here in the States, might be very different than how it is viewed, perhaps at a company, let's say in China. There's certainly a cultural element for any business that does need to be considered, as well as regulations that will need to be taken note of. This, of course, gets very challenging if your organization is international. You'll have to then get regional managers, people who are sort of embedded in the culture of that country and understand that country's regulations to help navigate, what's going on. But if you're not an international business, then you just need that, you just need people from that country who understand that country's approach to business and understand the regulations of said country. This really only gets more complicated when you are international. But all in all, with the culture and regulations considered, use that to help develop your security strategy. You help that to then build the policies. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm a bit of a visual person. A wall of text don't do much for me. I like a good diagram. Maybe you feel the same. This is perhaps then just a different way to look at what I was trying to discuss there. Culture and regulations need to be considered, as well as what are the business's goals. With both of these taken into mind, upper management would be in a position to develop a security strategy. How is security going to work for us? How's it going to make us that money or achieve whatever our goals may be, if not making money? I mean, nonprofits are a thing. What is going to be our overall strategy? Now, this strategy will definitely evolve over time, but hopefully it's mostly going to be the same. I mean, we'll add a little note here, we'll add a little note there. There can be some additions here and there, but for the most part, the foundation of it should be about the same. You're going to radically, change that. You're probably radically changing the business, at which point you start over and you reconsider your goals, you reconsider your culture. But with all that in place, now you can start writing out the policies. Now, I think we should start with a core security policy sort of up front. We could call this management security. We could call it the overarching security. We could just call it the core security policy. We're going to imagine a fictional company here, Matco, and say, all right, here at Matco, my company, I guess, we endeavor to have the greatest level of security for sensitive data that we are storing on behalf of our business partners, our customers, and our employees. We will, follow regulations and again, maintain the greatest level of security for the benefit of all. Done. Do note I never added anything specific in there as far as like, here's how we handle Wi-Fi. I did not mention vendors. I did not mention anybody by name. I kept it pretty grandiose, pretty vague, all things considered. What was I doing though? I was making an objective statement that tries to demonstrate like management's vision for security. Here's sort of the, oh, go ahead. Got a hot mic there. Anything I can help you with? Anything you'd like to add? Fair enough. I will assume that was an error. That's okay. So core security policy, right? Grandiose sort of overarching statement. We're going to maintain the best security for sensitive data. All I'm really doing here is I'm saying that the sensitive data needs to be protected. What clarifies sensitive data? We'll leave that for somewhere else. How we're going to do that? We're going to leave those details for somewhere else. We're just trying to make a statement here that will guide the creation of other policies. We're making a statement here that conveys management's overarching vision for security without having to get all the people involved in what is our strategy. They don't need to know that. They don't need to be worried about that. The janitor doesn't care, so we're not going to tell them. But this core security policy would probably be known to everybody and could probably be printed in every employee handbook or, sent out in recurring emails or maybe in all the training. Up front in all the training, we tell people, hey, we're going to be protecting sensitive data here, and we're going to be following the regulations, if not surpassing them, for everyone's benefit. Is that clear? And that's the goal of this core security policy. This becomes the inspiration and thereby to help develop more specific policies. You can have a remote access security policy. You can have a physical security policy. You can have a Wi-Fi security policy. I would go so far as to say these are functional policies. They outline the rules of certain functions. I'll zoom in on the Wi-Fi one. A bit of a, maybe, I don't know, nerd. I don't know how I would frame it. When it comes to networking, I love designing networks. I love Wi-Fi. Constantly trying to invent new forms of Wi-Fi and getting in on meetings about that. Wi-Fi security policy here would not dictate. It wouldn't say something like you have to use, Cisco. We're probably not going to mention vendors. We might not even mention like WPA2 or WPA3. We're not going to mention settings. We're not getting into configurations here. The goal of this Wi-Fi security policy is to outline, expectations. But then again, that's what's true of all policies. Outline an expectation. So here's an example of a Wi-Fi security policy. Here at Matco, we have at least two Wi-Fi networks. We have one for guests that's of a lower level of security, and we have one for enterprise activities that include sensitive data, and thereby will have the highest level of protections possible. We will use something like 802.1x for the highest level security, potentially thereby having unique usernames and passwords for all users, or something that's equivalent. The end. Don't get into the technical settings too far. You can hint at some of them, but you use sort of terminology that gives you an out if you need to, like saying 802.1x or greater, or saying using usernames and passwords for access or greater, gives me the room to later move to something greater if it comes out without having to revise them, which kind of brings up a point. These policies are like the foundation of the business. They're the pillars that everything else, they're holding everything up. We don't want them changing. Building collapses, you try to move one of those. We don't want these things changing. It would make management look kind of wishy-washy. It would make it look like management doesn't know what they're doing. If a company's policy is changing like every 6 weeks, I start wondering, do they know where we're going? Do they know where they're taking us? Do they know what they're doing? And that erodes the confidence of the entire team, the entire business. So very important that these policies sort of be written in such a way that you can just deploy them, make them known to everybody, and then call it a day. Yeah, they might need to be updated someday, but for the most part, we don't want to be updating them. We want these things to stand the test of time, written to last for years and become a nice foundation for everything else. Now, where are you going to get specific, though? You got to get specific somewhere. We're going to get specific with our standards, with our baselines, with our procedures. I'm not talking necessarily about an industry standard here. I'm talking about an internally developed business standard. Here's the standard our business has, for Wi-Fi. This is where I might dictate that the, enterprise network is to use WPA3 with AES 256 in what we call enterprise mode, aka 802.1 X-ray. That's where you get your details. And that standard can get updated. If a new form of WPA comes out someday and you want to upgrade to WPA4, not that that exists at the moment, but let's say it does, you could then update the standard without necessarily having to touch the policy. So standards will get updated as needed. Baselines are minimum configurations for a given system, updated accordingly. Procedures, step-by-step instructions on how to do something, update them as needed. And have them reference their parent policy, whenever necessary, or at least once, I would think. That's a good guideline, sort of, this standard was inspired by Wi-Fi policy, blah, blah, blah. That makes people think to themselves, well, if I have to update the standard, I got to be keeping it in line with the policy. I better go review that policy to make sure whatever new standard I'm going to propose to a change advisory board is in keeping with the overarching policy's expectations, and thereby management's expectations. Now, ISC 2 does say that policies are written to last for years. And again, that's why we try not to get too deep into the details with those. Meanwhile, they say standards and procedures are to be as specific as possible, which also implies that they may need to be updated more often than not. And that's fine. This overarching approach, though, does tend to lead to better governance. And I've seen places all over the place where, like, the difference between a policy, a procedure, and a standard couldn't be defined because they're basically using them as synonyms. They're using them interchangeably. And I don't know that that's necessarily the worst thing, but it lacks a structure. It's too whimsical, I feel like. It's without boundaries. And then it becomes unclear on where you should be checking. Well, how do I know what I should be doing next? Should I be reading the policy, the standard, or the procedure? If we've standardized it and we take this more approach, we can say, okay, procedures are step-by-step instructions. If I need step-by-step instructions, that's where I go. Now, what makes a policy good and effective? Anybody have a suggestion? Some of these are things that I've pointed out, but there may be additional things herein. Anyone have a suggestion on what makes a policy good and effective? It's understandable. Couldn't agree more, Joe. I think that's a pretty good one. Yeah, it's understandable. It has a defined scope. I really like that, Alex. I think that's really wise. I like that so much that I wish that I had that specifically as a bullet point on this page. And now I feel like I need to add it. That's really, really good. Um, yeah, we want it clear and concise. We want something that has a universal interpretation, nice and clear about what they're getting at. I don't want there to be multiple interpretations for a good policy. Of course, if we have multiple interpretations, then it's not a good policy. We want it to be relevant to the business, thereby current and not obsolete. If we got policies that no longer pertain because whatever, we got rid of Wi-Fi, well, then we don't need the Wi-Fi policy anymore. Archive it, get it out of the employee handbook. They don't need unnecessary stuff. Confuses the hell out of people. Enforceable and reasonably achievable. Reasonably achievable. Definitely seen policies where they get a little over the top and then you can't, like, there's no way to do it. If it's not something that can be done, we shouldn't be writing it out. Accessible by employees. To follow a rule, people need to know what it is. Applied fairly and consistently. Everybody that it applies to, we got to make sure they're following it. Boy, there's a lot of places where I feel like governments have failed on this. They make a law. Now, some of them are stupid. I'm not here to debate that. But like they make a rule, they make a law, they never enforce it. What point is it then to have it if you don't expect to do anything? Should be stable and enduring with a long-term focus. Absolutely. Should have consequences if violated. Incentives are nice too. Supported by management. I agree with that, Joe. I think that's another great one. Yeah, supported by management. You got to have, management backing it. Of course, that's the whole tie to that whole top-down approach. Got to have management backing it. If you don't have their backing, you got nothing. You got no ground to stand on. Yeah, that includes the resources. Absolutely. Outlines intent, but doesn't necessarily get to the standard or procedural level of detail. Again, we can save that for somewhere else. I think these are all good notes, and those are some great additions we got there. Now, what about role-based policies? What about role-based policies? Well, we could be talking about role-based access control. We could also talk about just making policies for certain roles that may exist in the business. Like, here is a policy that sort of outlines our management's expectation of like admins. So it becomes like our system custodian, our admin's policy. Not necessarily going to get down and again to step-by-step detail here. We leave that for a procedure. But the policy might say you have to follow procedures. And the policy might say, hey, here are some of your responsibilities. You're responsible for X, Y, and Z because that's, what's entailed by the job. If you are a database custodian, your job is to make sure the databases have, confidentiality, integrity, and availability in accordance with, policies for said systems and in keeping with the standards and yada, yada, yada. So, okay, we can have a role-based access control. That can be the technical side of a role-based policy. All in all, in the end, though, we're giving employees access to systems based off of their responsibilities, but we're also outlining what those responsibilities are. Right? A basic example, though, without getting too detailed, hey, a developer has write access to source code, repository, but not the finance servers. Now, what would be benefits of taking this sort of approach where we're not just making sort of policies that are grandiose across the entire business, but we make policies that are for each type of role that might exist in a business? Well, this might be a way to apply some least privilege, right? Without necessarily having to do it on a per person basis. Least privilege. Never give anyone access to something they don't need access to. Give them just what they need for their job. I mean, basically what we're saying up here, but also implying, again, no more than is necessary. You know, this guy needs a saw and a hammer and nails to do his job. We give him a saw, we give him a hammer, we give him nails to do his job, but we don't give him anything past that because he doesn't need anything past that. And anything beyond that creates possible attack vectors. So we're limiting here, in a sense, what we're going to give people, but instead of doing it on a per person basis, we're doing it per role, per job title, basically. Because I assume you can definitely have an occasion where there's one person and that's the only person who has that job. But like, if you take the role approach, if that person changed jobs, hey guys, I know I've been the system custodian and the only one at that for the last 9 months or the last 10 years. I'm going to go do something else. You don't have to take their account and give it to someone else. Make someone else's account, take that role, assign it to the new user. Boom. Absolutely. Less work for the admins. I agree completely, Joe. So, what else would this offer us? Reduce the scope of insider threats because we have that least privilege, and thereby not everybody has access to everything. Reduce the risk of insiders. Reduce human error due to misconfigured accounts to some degree because you're not doing things on a per person basis, and the administrative overhead is lessened. Helps too when people are changing roles. Hey, do care. How so? Demonstrates commitment to security. Lots of the frameworks and a lot of the guidelines that are out there request this. They want us to use some form of role-based approach to managing our users. So by doing so, we're demonstrating a commitment to security. We're doing our due care. We're in keeping with those regulations and or guidelines. And if the regulation doesn't require it, the guideline suggests it, and you get in trouble for something, you can say, well, look, we are trying. Demonstrating that we're trying is certainly worth more than it sounds like. This is a start. Easier to comply then with regulations that require it. Here's a list of regulations that all specify that role-based security or role-based permission management is needed in some capacity. Training can now be tailored and streamlined. You gave a guy a hammer, you only need to show him how to use the hammer. He's not getting access to those other things. For example, the developer doesn't have access to the finance system, and thereby we don't have to explain to them anything about the finance system. Not that we wanted to, but now we know we don't have to. And you don't have access, so we don't need questions about it. That kind of approach. I also agree there. Yeah, we're going to be able to manage those roles, assign them the users, group users accordingly based off of roles. Yeah, just overall management of users' permissions becomes so much easier here. And that thereby even means that we're also streamlining some amount of identity access management. The provisioning of accounts, the creation of accounts and giving them those permissions while still following least privilege is also streamlined by this. So definitely a better way to handle things going forward. We'll start on the administrative side, though, by writing out policies, from the managerial side on paper that are going to be put in those employee handbooks. We can then get on the logical side, use things like role-based access control, maybe even to some degree attribute-based access control to help enforce this on a technical side. But all around, much better way to manage things. This brings us to one of our the last two topics here in this little section: frameworks and classification. Frameworks, much like the policies, are just there to help structure things, help build things up. Since I imagine most folks here are familiar with a framework already, we won't spend much time talking about this topic. We'll just point out a couple key facets here of frameworks. Number one, we don't want to reinvent the wheel when it comes to governance. We don't need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to developing security, be that a security perhaps at a business that doesn't exist, You got to start at the ground and work your way up, or you're coming in a place already has security and you just want to improve it. In either situation, no need to reinvent things. Follow a framework. Brilliant minds, experts in the field, have already written out these frameworks, these how-to guides on how to structure security, how to measure it, how to improve it, etc. Rely on that, or at least look to them for inspiration and guidance. So what we're saying here is best practice today, use a well-known and time-tested framework. A framework developed by the brightest minds, the brightest experts. We'll use that to influence, how we improve an already existing security platform or program or system. We might use it to build one from the ground up. But it's scaffolding. It's scaffolding relative to construction, here for security management. So you could say thereby that frameworks can be used to build or improve a security management system. They might give you a way to measure your current capabilities or lack thereof, which is kind of nice. Measure and demonstrate progress towards a target capability. You use a framework, you get a measurement here, they plant a flag in the ground, and they give us a grade of say C. We've been working on our security, working on it. We rerun the framework's assessment, and it gives us a new score of B. We can thereby clearly demonstrate we are moving forward. Remember, we're not moving forward, we're dying. It's a business. So demonstrate you're moving forward. And in a lot of places, that satisfies a lot of regulations, just demonstrating an effort. Provide a verifiable statement for compliance. You might have to be able to get a specific score or be able to check specific boxes according to the framework in order to meet a regulation. As in, some of the frameworks have become compulsory, have become like a law, and that can happen. Not all of them were meant to do this. A lot of them were just meant to be that structure, those guidelines, those suggestions, but some have become, laws in some places, and you might need to use them to then measure and make sure you are in compliance. All right, so let's know what tools we got in that tool bag. Let's know what frameworks are out there. This is not an exhaustive list, as I feel like it would have taken 50 slides to do that, and an hour to a week of time, depending on how detailed we wanted to get. Here was a brief naming of a few of the classics. SABSA, the Sherwood Applied Business Security Architecture. Certainly a big business sort of thing for really big organizations. I don't really feel like it's necessary for like a mom and pop kind of shop. But ultimately speaking, it starts with helping or forcing you to outline your business's objectives. With your business objectives and goals in mind, it then suggests to you ways to develop security policies that enforce that. So basically everything I've been talking about up to this point, very similar to SABSA. Figure out what your goals are, figure out what the regulations are, then make policies that help reflect that. They take you through a several-step process that helps get that done. And they figure once you got those well-built policies, you just roll with that. This is a functional vehicle now, this business. We got COBIT. This is made by ISACA. The control the objectives for information and related technologies. This helps a business reconcile its goals with what the IT department thinks its goals are. It helps break down the barriers between upper management, who doesn't necessarily speak the IT lingo, explains them like how to better communicate to the IT department and how to better set expectations the IT department can reasonably meet. So I honestly feel like big thing here, break down communication barriers and set reasonable objectives for your IT team. Not explicitly security related, but at making it security related, very, very easy. More just better management of the IT department. COSO's ERM. This is an enterprise risk management guide. Basically helps us analyze what risks might exist to our business's goals, and then suggests various ways we can deploy controls, mechanisms to try and thwart those risks, those attack vectors, etc. Very big picture, though. It's not the only framework that exists, however. COSO's also got an internal control integrated framework. This one doesn't look at, it's not it's like, I feel like ERM is very much looking at like who's going to get in the way of your business's goals. And it like zooms out to look at lots of external potential threats. There's mention of the risks of insiders, but they're looking more at like, okay, what about other businesses? What about the geopolitical landscape? What about tariffs? What about this other nation state? What about our competitors? That's where ERM feels like it lands. ICIF, they're very focused on insider threats. So they start talking about the importance of separation of duties and how to do it properly. They talk about job rotation for the sake of redundancy, sharing knowledge, but also for detecting potential threats and as a deterrent. They talk about mandatory vacations and how those would be, how they would be used. All about preventing insider fraud, and thereby feels like big in the banking or anybody with financial systems might be very interested in this one. International Standard Organization, 27,000 series. I need a little X there. Anything in the 27, actually most people just call it the 27K series. Maybe that's how I'll have this guy changed. Let's see, can I edit that? There we go. Anything in the 27,000 family is all about how to develop an information security management system. And this is an international framework. COSO, the Committee for Sponsoring Organizations, I think is one of their what one of the acronyms stands for. It's a think tank. It's an organization. Let me make sure I got my acronym right. The Committee of Sponsoring Organizations. Yeah. So yeah, it's just a just a little think tank out there. Little Treadway Commission. They have monthly kind of meetings. They talk about how to better guide businesses to making good decisions. Very similar to like in spirit to like NIST and ISO. But here, ISO, this one, again, international, draws from all the countries, and gets more recognition than I think most of these probably do. These guys up top, Western Europe, United States, very common. Not to say that you can't find them in other places, but like, I doubt that they've heard of those in Eastern Europe. I bet China's never once talked about one of those, or it would seem very unlikely. But the ISOs, boy, they show up everywhere. International Standards Organization takes input from just about everybody, and thereby seems to be very, well, international. It's right there in the name. With 27001, and they do that with all the international standards. They do this. They handle definitions. In the very first part of the 27,000 series, which is all about IT security, they define terms. They also list out requirements for any good security system. Now, these requirements, though, are not insane. These are very basic, like any account that has the ability to change settings or any account that has access to sensitive information should be lockable behind some form of authentication. Ooh, so we can set a password. Yeah, that is kind of bottom of the barrel. They don't even get to the point of like telling you how long passwords technically would have to be or something like that. If they were, they'd probably say, 8 characters. Real minimum level stuff, but mainly a list of definitions and basic requirements for any system anywhere, because they're not getting specific yet. In 27002, this is where they do guidelines. This is where we see things like passwords, longer is better. Real strength for passwords starts showing up when you're not at 8 characters, but more like 12 characters, 15 characters. And honestly, if you're looking for strength out of an authentication system, then why not lean more on multi-factor? You're like, oh, okay, cool. After that point, they start getting more and more detailed. By the time you're at 27017, they're listing out definitions and requirements for cloud security. By the time you're at 27018, they're talking about definitions of privacy for cloud security. By the time you're getting to 27701, they're talking about GDPR, but applied to the international community. Privacy stuff, but not just cloud providers, and like really getting into what is a data controller versus a data processor. All in all, though, a pretty good suite with well over like what you could probably clarify is about 35 different frameworks in that family. And depending on what you're doing, some assortment of those may be of use to you. How about NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Tech? Now, technically, this is we're back to US stuff. NIST is part of the US federal government, right? NIST Special Publication 853, right? A library of IT standards for IT security. This special publication inspires something called CISSP, the National Institute for Standards and Technology's Cyber Security Framework. This outlines best practices for selecting controls and even the creation of some policy stuff, and also includes a how-to on risk management, which will be our next module here in a few minutes. We've got the NIST RMF as well, the risk management framework. While this has a lot to do with risk management, it's specifically about how to bring risk management and security to a system development life cycle, which really means unless you are developing products for the US government, you probably don't care about it. Starts getting heavily focused on like defense contractors. So probably should have been called like NIST's defense contractor framework instead of the risk management framework. Well, nonetheless, a framework that exists out there. A couple other honorable mentions. CIS, the Center for Internet Security's list of controls and their framework outlines all sorts of technical and operational controls that would be very useful and very necessary if you are dealing with anything that's internet facing, like web servers. And ITIL, right? A framework too for improving an IT department's efficiency. Cool. Some honorable mentions. Now, classification. Almost all of the frameworks mention that you need some form of classification, and lots of the regulations also dictate this is true. All right, so most frameworks recommend, most regulations require classifying an asset. And by doing so, you are demonstrating a component of due care. Now, in most cases, the more sensitive an asset is, the more valuable it is to us, the greater the classification. As in, higher levels of classification get better protection. You know, the US government does this in a way that is not too hard to understand, I feel like. At the top, they've got top secret. Under that, they've got secret. Under that, they have confidential. It's a hierarchical system where at the top, the highest level is top secret, and that is what we use for the most sensitive of assets. The fewest people have access, the greatest level of protections. All in all, though, which classification is applied to an asset should be based off of a company policy and or standard. But like, all right, what are we doing here? We're giving information the right level of protection. You know, we don't need to encrypt everything with AES-256. That's too much. AES-256 is great. It's a great form of encryption. It's even quantum resilient if done properly, you know, which means a quantum computer will have a challenge breaking it. The problem, though, is that using it everywhere, well, it's computationally expensive. It makes the computer slower. It makes the system slower. It's harder on the equipment. So why use it then in places where you don't need it? You know, again, back to that right tool for the right job. We want to give the right level of protection to assets. Only what they need, not necessarily more, because that will slow us down, wear out the equipment, cost us a higher electrical bill in some instances. So the right level of protection here. How do we do it? We affix a security label or tag to an asset. We are marking our assets. This is top secret, this is secret, this is confidential. The end result, only people with the proper rights, you know, are going to have access. Only people who have the right level of clearance can reach those things. If I have top secret clearance, it's reasonable I could reach top secret, secret, and confidential. However, if I do not have top secret, let's say I've got secret clearance, it is reasonable to assume I could reach that level and down, but probably have no access to top secret if the system is configured properly. This brings us, though, to a point of guidance when it comes to classification. Proper classification wants to be proportionally protecting assets based off of their relative value to the business. If you're not sure what the value is, then turn your, maybe attention to the legal side of things to help maybe bring that into focus. If a law requires you to classify something a certain way, then obviously you classify it as that level or higher. But like past that, good classification, as outlined in policies and company standards, should be proportionally protecting assets based off of their value, meaning the most valuable things probably get top secret or something equivalent, and we work our way down. Note that the US government typically uses those three levels: top secret, secret, and confidential. And that's because having too many levels, like let's say 20 levels, creates a fairly meaningless and confusing system. We want to keep it granular. We want to have tiers, but honestly, any more than 7 creates a problem. So 3 to 7, in my sort of expert opinion here, seems to be the best place. You could do 3 levels, you could do 4, you could do 5, never more than 7. And we're tiering our security here for our assets. As an asset's values change, and it very well may, we review the classification and decide whether it needs to be increased or decreased. Assets will be classified at the time they are created and or collected. I don't want to be storing something on a hard drive and saying, I'll worry about protecting it later. The bad guy's going to steal it right now, I bet. Let's give it the protection it needs at the point it is being stored, created, and or collected. Anything that is unlabeled, anything that is untagged should be treated as the highest level of classification until some analysis reveals otherwise. If you stumble across a file and you're like, wait a minute, this thing wasn't properly classified, reasonable to set it to the highest level for a given system, again, until someone tells you otherwise. This brings us to the end of this section and a little exercise. Let's imagine there are 3 levels of classification used at our pharmaceutical company. That's very important. At our pharmaceutical company, we've got restricted, confidential, and internal. The restricted here at the top in red, very few people have access and thereby the greatest level of protections. The tier underneath of that is confidential. A few departments have access, so more people. And medium level protections, less protections. And then finally, internal use only. Multiple departments have access. So maybe the difference is between 3 people having access, 100 people having access, and 1,000 people having access. I don't know, something like that. And the lowest level of protections here for this internal use only. We've been given these 3 levels of classification in that hierarchical order, and we're going to try and apply these to the assets below, considering the asset's business value and reasonable business practices. Or in other words, consider how many people might need access and consider how valuable it is to us. Here are our 3, and we're going to use each of these classification levels once. We've got patient medical records. We've got research and development for a new drug treatment, like a drug's formula here at this pharmaceutical company. And we've got the mailing list of participating doctors. All right. I want to know which of these is restricted. Which of these, the fewest people need access and would probably need the greatest amount of protections because of the value of the asset? Which of these 3 would you list as restricted? Interesting. Split the room a little bit. I expected so. Now, Patient medical records certainly need protection. No doubt about that. No doubt they do. Certainly no way they're going to end up being internal use only. Now, if a regulation that's clearly displayed in front of us says they have to be listed as restricted, then they have to be listed as restricted. That's what it is. I don't have that in front of me. And chances are, honestly, that's not, and restricted, by the way, it's sort of in this case, being the top level is kind of like, it's kind of top secret. It's kind of top secret. And we're probably only going to have, like I said, like 3 people having access. I bet more people than 3 need access to the medical records. And I don't think they need that highest level of protection. They need protection, but it might not be the highest. It's certainly not the most valuable to the business either. In the grand scheme of value to the business, the research and development for a new drug treatment, the drug's formula itself, that's going to be at the top. Businesses sink millions, if not billions, of dollars into the R&D of a new formula. I mean, a tremendous amount of science goes into all of that. A tremendous amount of time, and time is money, goes into making that drug formula. And how many people need access to that drug formula? Probably not that many. So I'm figuring here, we're going to only have 3 people that have access to that thing, if not less. I mean, Coca-Cola keeps it down to 2. Only 2 people ever know the full recipe to Coca-Cola. 2 people. If one of them dies, the survivor's job is to tell the other one. They never fly on the same plane and they never eat the same meal. Like, oh yeah, tremendous resources for R&D. Tremendous resources. And yeah, very valuable, as said. So research and development, insanely valuable, gives us a competitive angle, gives our business the ability to make that money in the future. If we lose that, if Coca-Cola loses their secret recipe and that just becomes public knowledge, they've diversified enough that they'd survive, but like Coca-Cola is a product that they've been leaning on for decades, if not at a point almost to a century, like would effectively no longer be a secret. And that's going to be super damaging. So we got to protect that asset. That asset is critical and doesn't need a lot of people accessing it. Greatest level of protections, we're restricting that drug formula. Now, when I think about the medical records, I could reasonably see about 100 people maybe needing access to those. These medical records might be the results of a case study with the drug formula. You're probably going to have a fair amount of people that need to look over that. Nurses, doctors, scientists. And yeah, leaking it might get us fined by HIPAA if we're in the United States. Bold of me to assume we are. Leaking that, might get us in trouble with HIPAA here in the States. But like, that will be a slap on the wrist financially compared to the R&D. And I don't know that we need to use the highest level of encryption. Again, more people probably need access. I bet that's the confidential level. The business needs to protect its most valuable assets first, and that gets the highest level. Not everything's going to need the highest level of protections. So we're probably going to end up with a slightly lower level for patient. Now, are we still protecting it? Yes. And in grand scheme of things, we're probably still meeting HIPAA regulation here with this confidential. I mean, they don't require the most heaviest duty. They just need something. We're going to make sure that something is in keeping with the regulation, but still. Mailing list for participating doctors. Now, this is probably actually public information. In a lot of cases, doctors that are involved in some sort of study for testing out some new formula or whatever is usually public information. But like, all right, so bottom of the barrel, we don't really care about that too much. And assumedly, more people would even need to know access or need to know that. More people need to know it, so it gets the lowest level of protections. So the protections are also about like these levels of classification, how much protection you're giving to something, but it also takes a look at, it also zooms in just a little bit on like how many people need access. The fewest people, a little more, almost everyone. And you can see how like we kind of break that down there as well. Module 2, risk management. Our goals here are to discuss ways to identify and evaluate risks. Give a quick rundown of the big forms of risk assessment, like quantitative versus qualitative. And then we're going to talk briefly about, the risk mitigation strategies and risk transference, which will bring up some interesting points that are probably beyond most courses about like risk transference does not make you any less accountable. It really only deals with the finance side of things, which is not going to repair a brand's image. But all right, let's dig on into it. And then after this guy, we'll take a little break. A risk management program is essential for an organization's long-term success. Okay, I could buy that. That's why a lot of people today say all businesses need GRC. They need good governance, they need risk management, and they need to make sure they're staying compliant. Compliance, governance, risk, and compliance. And I can buy that. We moved on now from that governance into the risk management. And we'll see compliance come up in the next one when we get to the legal stuff. All in all, risk management here, right? We're trying to contain a risk to acceptable levels. Going outside is a risk. Walking up and down the stairs, a risk. Getting in a car, a risk. A greater risk probably than those other ones. All things considered, though, like any business function presents a risk to our company. We're here trying to make sure that those risks are brought down to a level that is reasonably acceptable. And in some cases, that means you don't have to do anything at all. But in other places, you might say, this business practice is a little too risky the way it exists at the moment, and it's going to cut too deeply into our profits. It's going to stop us from reaching that goal. So what do? We deploy security. And with that security, that risk, that chance of getting hacked, that chance of having all of our data stolen, that chance of the servers being brought offline to a denial of service is lowered to a level that feels more reasonable. We're going to use our risk management as well to help focus our security efforts, help inform management and leadership in their long-term strategic decision-making. We're going to get it here to help us minimize losses, and in some instances, keep us compliant with regulations. As some regulations state, you must have somebody doing risk management at your business as part of security in order to be in compliance. If they state that, then cool. Because what they might be looking for here is just a demonstration of due care, a demonstration that you're trying. Now, an IT risk management program, if done properly, should be enterprise-wide. Far too often, they'll be like, okay, we've got a risk management process, but they're only looking at the servers. They never consider anything outside of the logical configuration of the servers. Whoop, way too narrow. Well, I bet the configuration of those servers is top notch, like top of the class, but you give a bad guy physical access and all that goes out the window. You give me 15 minutes with physical access to a router and I don't care what you've done to it, I'll probably be in control of it. So it's like, we really got to be making sure we're covering all our bases here. We need to bring this to an enterprise-wide approach. Now, it does need to be cost effective. I can imagine making this thing, zoomed out here and looking at risks to the entire business could end up becoming a lot of things to go through and pretty expensive. Yes, but we can try to streamline a little bit. Cost effective. How do you do that? You zoom in on what are the most important elements of the business. You figure out what are your critical business functions, and you start there. With those protected, you then work your way out, which, could be why they were zoomed in on the servers to begin with, but start in one spot, work your way out, start with the most critical things first. Yeah, and layer the security. I agree, defense in depth completely. All right, of course, helps to keep us compliant, sure. But also that also means the risk management people, the people doing the risk management need to have a little bit of awareness of law and policy for wherever they are located. Needs that management support, like all good policies and really anything of that matter. You got to have management's backing. You got to have their funding, their authority. Should be auditable, meaning there should be like a paper trail and proof that this is a process that's being undertaken, which means we need like records. This is an element of the due diligence. Providing record that we are going through this process. Having a risk management program required. How do you prove it? Make sure it's auditable. Make sure there are records. There's a paper trail. This is why like risk registers are so critical. A risk register is a document where you list out all the risks and how you're addressing them and who's responsible for making sure those problems are solved. Managed and monitored, of course. Repeatable. This is going to be a cyclical process. Like most things in security, it's not one and done. We have to go back and repeat. Go back and repeat, 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 repeat. As the threat landscape, the risks to a business, constantly in flux, constantly changing. Now, there have been different approaches over the years to doing risk management. This list that I'm making here is in keeping with some older documentation, but I've added some notes to it, and all around, I'm using this list. This is not like a list that somebody should be memorizing. I'm using this list as talking points for the overall feeling and the overall process, and what are some of the key points that are sometimes skipped and overlooked, when it comes to doing risk management. Start with asset identification. A lot of places kind of skip past that or aren't quite so thorough there. I feel like if I'm going to build a house, I want to make sure it's on stable ground. And here we are making sure we get a list of everything. We're building a strong foundation, and we're going to make sure that this step is very stable. This is our foundation that the rest of it will be built off of. What do we have? Can't protect things you don't know you have. This is a critical first step to disaster recovery, business continuity, risk management, security in general. Have an inventory. With a thorough inventory of assets, which doesn't just include equipment necessarily, a list of people included, a list of skill sets, a list of procedures. Assets are of anything of value to a business. We're listing out all of those here. With that list in hand, we can then begin our risk identification. We're going to talk in a moment about how to do some of that. But ultimately here, risk identification, we're trying to determine what are the threats, as in the threat actors, who is going to harm us, and the threat vectors, the how. And in some instances, the actor might be Mother Nature. But we need to be figuring out who's going to harm us and what potential there is for damages here in our risk identification. We'll look at how to figure that out here in a minute. Now that you've had that conversation and done some investigation there as to what risks may exist, then we can get really a little bit further into the risk analysis of it. How so? How is that different than identification? Well, identification is like who and what. Analysis is like, all right, what's the impact? What's the likelihood? I want to know what is the impact of any given attack, as in the single loss expectancy, how much we are losing. And that might be hard to quantify. That might be hard to put a number to, but if we can, we probably should. And we need to know likelihood, like annual rate of occurrence. How often does this happen? Frequency, likelihood. How often does this attack happen? Some attacks are once in a lifetime. Other things happen every day. If you end up, though, with a risk that is high impact and high likelihood, surely that would be more concerning than something with a low impact and a high likelihood, or perhaps something with a high impact, low likelihood. Something that's high for both of them, something very likely to happen and very damaging. This kind of rises to the top of the list of things we need to do something about. And we can move on to assessment and evaluation. Basically take multiple risks, put them in a hierarchical order, put them in a document, make that risk register. This is going to be something that might need to be auditable later. We're putting everything out in a document. Here it is. Number 1 risk, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. We write out what is the impact. We write out descriptions of the risks. It would help if I could spell today. Description. There we go. We're going to write out likelihood. We're going to write out what do we think the best defense is. We're going to write out on this document what controls could be used to protect us, and then we're going to say who is the owner of those controls, who's responsible, who's going to be held accountable for making sure those firewalls get deployed. I'm going to outline all of that there. Then we can, risk treatment. Now you might say, well, wasn't that part of? Well, yeah. I mean, first we make the document, the hierarchical document that lists out all the risks. This is the true. Now the assessment's really coming into focus. Now we're in a position of being able to evaluate what are the biggest problems, and we apply those treatments. And of course, we apply, whatever treatments, whatever solutions have the greatest return on security investment, the greatest ROSI. We want to see, basically that we're getting our money back plus some. Spend let's say $6,000 to save 1 million. Now that's a damn fine deal. If I can spend $6,000 on, let's say, antivirus or an uninterrupted power supply that saves me in the end millions of dollars of damage, I've saved this company a tremendous amount of money, folks. And that's what it's about. This is where security saves us money. This is where it helps the business thrive. We want to select a control with the greatest return on investment. And then, of course, outline that in the register. I'm glad you agree, Michael. Side note, did this for a little while. You can make some great money, in the security world by being the person who does a lot of this risk management. The note is, I would say, from having done this, it's exhausting. It is not a one and done process. It becomes your life, and it becomes everything that you think about every time you close your eyes. But if done properly, you'll make for a very successful business, and that comes with very nice bonuses. Risk monitoring, right? Risk monitoring. All right, we're looking at those treatments and saying, did they work? Could they do better? Are there better treatments? Did the treatment we thought was going to work not work, or not work well enough? And there's this new product out there that's going to do better. We're looking at the risk. We're looking at that treatment. We're also looking to see if the impact and likelihoods are changing. Hey, they do change. This whole thing is fluid, man. We're on a boat in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of a storm. Things are constantly changing, reevaluating, monitor. If everything that you've done so far up to this point looks good, then repeat. You go back to step one, you say, what didn't we look at? Zoom out, look for new problems, start fixing them. They're there. There will always be vulnerabilities. There will always be weaknesses. There will always be threats that we missed the first time through. We repeat over and over and over again, a cyclical process, never one and done. But all right, back to the middle of this. How do we determine the threats? Like who the threats are, so we can ultimately calculate risk. Well, there's a lot of places, actually, a lot of sources for finding information about different threats and potential risks. Hey, go out there and look at some of the industry standards. Most of the standards that are out there, like the best practices on like why you should be using encryption here and not there, were written to counter a threat. They didn't write that up just because they felt like it. They were like, no, because we've had a problem. Here's what we think we should be doing about it. So industry standards and best practice publications probably give you a little bit of a feel here for, what a little bit of your threat landscape and the world at large. Alex, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your train of thought. I was just going back to like the 6 steps. What I think I'm typically used to and understanding when I'm doing the risk identification and thinking about the threats. What I didn't hear you say, but I might have just missed it, so apologies, is the type of risk, meaning like, is it reputational? Is it financial? Is it compliance, legal related? That was the part like when you were talking about the actors and the vectors, totally makes sense. But like, is that bundled into that?
It's
or is
bundled
it
into it.
somewhere else? Okay.
Yep, no, that's
Thanks.
certainly part of it. So many different types of risks. I mean,
Yeah.
goodness gracious, it's almost hard to quantify the different types because there are so many. There are people-made risks, there are environmental risks, there are PR risks, public relations, the business's image. The types of risks are varied.
Okay, makes sense. And like to your point, the way in which they come in, if it's a hacker, if it's an internal, like it bubbles up back to the type of risk that it is. So understood. Thanks.
Yep. For what it's worth, when we get to risk transference, we'll get a hint of some element of that point of discussion. Great insights. So, industry standards and publications can give you an idea of what risks might be out there. Audit reports can also give you some insight. After incident reports give us some insight. I don't particularly love that because it feels like I'm in a reactive position and I prefer to be proactive when possible. But if there were incidents, I better learn from them. Threat models. This is like looking at a program from an adversary's point of view. There are lots of different threat models out there. There's Stride, there's Octave, there's Pasta, there's Trike. Oh, there's so many different threat models, but they're all just ways of looking at something from the bad guy's point of view and saying, what would they be capable of? What could they see? What could they try to do to us? And which of those are the biggest problems? Performing one of those actions perhaps on a database or on a system might give you some idea of a risk that you were otherwise unaware of or hadn't considered. Pen test reports, sure. Cyber threat intelligence. This is the one I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. CTI, cyber threat intelligence, helps us keep abreast of the ever-evolving world. What types of threats are out there today? Help us maybe respond quicker to potential threats. Help us deploy defenses before the threat arrives at our doorstep. Basically keeping up with the news in a sense. But there's different places to get your news. When it comes to this cyber threat intelligence, here's 3 things that I would want to be looking for. I want information that is accurate. And not everything on Facebook and Reddit is. I want something that's accurate. So accuracy is pretty important to me. I think timeliness. I need information that's not 10 years old. I need intelligence about an attack. I need to know what the bad guys are up to today. What is the newest type of malware? I don't care about a worm or a virus from 20 years ago. I want to know about stuff today. So accuracy and timeliness. There's one last piece. Relevancy. The threat intelligence that is such a critical point to our cybersecurity efforts must be relevant. And that's where I find I run into a problem with just like the news and Reddit and a lot of newsletters for that matter. They start telling me about this new type of malware that targets this specific distro of Linux. And then I go, I don't even have one of those. Or that system's air gapped and thereby I don't care. And I end up in this weird spot more often than not, where now I feel like I'm reading something that doesn't really pertain to me. We want to get information that is as relevant as possible, lest we be wasting our time. Now, there's people who have said to me, well, I've got all the time in the world. No, we don't. I wish we did. There's going to end up being so much. You end up getting information from so many different places, and if only 1% of that is relevant, you are sifting through a giant haystack looking for a single needle, and you're going to miss some of the needles, and that's not good. So we want accurate information, we want timely information, we want relevant information. And those are sort of 3 metrics that I look for when I consider where I'm getting my threat intelligence from. Here are some of the sources, though, that are out there. There are public repositories. There's the National Vulnerability Database, NVD, and they also put out publications periodically about big vulnerabilities, little alerts, a big vulnerability here, big vulnerability there. But again, is it relevant? It might be timely and it might be highly accurate, but is it relevant? Ugh, you know, um, it depends. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. Um, but that's just kind of, just a challenge to this whole process. Vendor specific, all right, those are nice if you've got those vendors equipment. If you got Cisco gear, cool. You got Microsoft gear, great. They got blogs, they've got news feeds. Check out one of those and ignore the ones that aren't relevant to you, because again, it's only so much time. Industry specific. Now, this I like because, as far as I'm concerned, this tends to check all three of those boxes. It tends to be relevant, pretty timely, and usually with a high degree of accuracy. An ISAC, an information sharing and collaboration, sometimes called information sharing and collaboration centers. All right. Here's the website for the National Council of ISACs, who their job is just keep track of all the ISACs that exist. I'm going to go ahead and share this in chat for those who are interested. They basically got these clubs that share intelligence, share information, and you can join them, sign up for their newsletters. Some of them require you to prove you're a member of that industry, like they kind of gatekeepy, because they're worried about maybe threat actors listening in to their information and so forth, and they don't necessarily want the threat actors to know what they know. So some of them require you to prove you work in that industry. But all right, let's say you do. Prove it to them, join this, you'll get emails, you get news alerts, and it becomes a sharing and collaboration center where we can communicate with other businesses in our industry, getting that information that's relevant, having a feed to experts in our industry, so we should have a pretty high level of accuracy, and giving us a method to which to communicate with other businesses in our industry, so our information rather should be pretty timely for the most part. We've got a club here, a council for the American chemistry. We've got an ISAC for automotive. We've got one for aviation. We got one for communications. We've got one for downstream and natural gas, who changed their logo pretty recently. It's pretty cool. I like it. Elections infrastructure, electricity, emergency, financial, food and agriculture, healthcare. There's two of them there. Information and technology. This is the one I usually keep an ear to. Maritime transport, media and entertainment, multi-state, national defense, oil and natural gas, real estate, research and education, retail and hospitality, small broadband, space, space ISAC, which deals with satellites and stuff over in Colorado Springs. We got offices over there, very nice. We've got transportation, like public transportation, tribal. That's a fairly new one in the grand scheme of this list, and water, and surely more to be added over time here. Now these are mainly for the states, for the U.S. side, but some of them, allies of the United States, you'll find information fed in from them as well. Like this one is mainly operating in the United States, but also Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Still cool, a nice place to go for some threat intelligence, and they might send you a little email newsletter that's like, hey, warning, we know that you, according to your profile, you have devices that use Windows 10. A new vulnerability has been detected with Windows 10 as of an hour ago that allows someone to do remote code execution. Here is the best way to deal with that threat. Click here if you have any information or if you've been targeted by this attack. And it's like, yo, that's pretty cool. Get that as an email, hell, they're practically reaching out to me at this point. The dark web, chat rooms, paste bins, all the unindexed parts of the internet where, criminals may be gathering, planning their attacks. Sometimes there's a little bit of a heads up on the dark web, before attacks happen. But you know what? That would require you to, one, be out there monitoring it. and 2, know how to navigate it. And maybe 3, you're only 2 steps away or 3 clicks away from seeing something you can't unsee. So like, I don't know that that's for everybody. And it also feels like you're going to be getting a lot of unrelevant information, maybe things that aren't so timely, things that might not also be very accurate. I'm not going to put that high on my list. Conferences, not bad, but maybe not so timely as they're not constantly ongoing. Trade groups, IC2 has some local chapters and so forth. That's pretty helpful, but it tends not to be industry specific and thereby not quite as focused. So I think if the grand scheme of things, winner in my book, ISACs for threat intel. Now, risk analysis and assessment, right? We're trying to determine impact and likelihood, so we can ultimately prioritize our risks, and maybe if we're lucky, determine how much to spend on controls. That brings us then to the qualitative approach to risk assessment. What we like about the qualitative approach is that it is fast. It doesn't require a lot of research, doesn't require any formulas, and it is very useful when determining or for when calculating risk to intangible assets. Very useful in places where you're like, I'm not so sure how much that's worth. So calculating impact becomes almost impossible. We need not worry about this. There's not going to be a formula here. Again, this doesn't require a formula. It doesn't require any form of real research. And thereby it's going to be very good for calculating risks to intangible assets, and fast at that. Well, there's got to be a pitfall here somewhere, right? This sounds like it's great. Requires a lot of industry experience to do this. You have to know your business very well. This is not something I could do if I just got hired today. Yeah, this is like almost all C-suite and primarily or managers that have been there for a while. Like hard to do on day one. I agree, Joe. Doesn't provide financial information. We don't get any dollar values from this at the end. So thereby we don't get really any insight as to like budget stuff, which is kind of unfortunate. All right. Now, some folks, when they like to do this process, they talk about the impact as high, medium, or low. And then they talk about likelihood as high, medium, or low. That's sort of a CSF, the cybersecurity framework, more of their approach, more of NIST's approach. On the more international side, people like to plot things on a scale of 1 to 5 and put things on a chart, as I'm going to demonstrate. In either regard, you're good, as long as you've got lots of experience to pull from. So a quick, time is always against us. Example, what are we more concerned about? The CEO or an intern abruptly leaving the company? Now, in one company, the answer might be the CEO. In another company, it might be the interns. It is purely about this company here, and thereby only something, an insider at that company, again, with lots of experience could do. But let's say we do imagine a chart here, and we're going to use that 1 to 5 approach with likelihood 1 to 5 on the left and impact 1 to 5 down here on the bottom. And now using my experience, using my knowledge of this business, I think to myself, The interns leave pretty frequently. Now, do all the interns leave? No. 5 is like 100%. I don't feel like all of the interns leave, but I feel like a bunch of them do. Is it more than half? I feel like at this company it is. So I say a 4 as far as likelihood when it comes to interns. We'll do interns first. Now, as far as impact goes, we don't give these interns very much. So when they leave, it's not that big a deal. Maybe I say it's a 1. Note there's no 0 on this chart, as if there was no impact at all and it was purely like no one cares and no one will ever care, then we really shouldn't be discussing it at all. But like, all right, a 1, cool. 1 and 4, plot the point. Here's my intern. Clearly, we have some concern. Basically, anything down here in like the green is probably our acceptable risks, and we're really not super worried about the acceptable risks, because we're like, hey, listen, it's a problem, yeah, but we accept it. It's just part of doing business, man. It's all good. We'll deal with it if we need to, but otherwise it's acceptable as it is. Yeah, I don't think we're in that box. We're in this sort of middle ground here where it's like, this is concerning. We should probably do something about it if time permits. The real question to me becomes, is anything over here? Anything, and some people like to just do it as like they just draw a box here. Other people like to do it like I've done here with a weird heat map. But it's basically like anything in this red quadrant here. I'm going to say this is something that requires pretty much immediate discussion. These are concerning problems that need to be dealt with now. These are things that have a pretty high impact and a pretty high likelihood. So we talk about the CEO. We think about it. We say, you know what? Yeah, I think he's going to leave, man. Like, he doesn't seem super happy. Certainly not like a 1 or 2 on likelihood. I'm saying like there's a 50% chance that I feel like he's just going to up and leave in the next year. So we all talk it out and we agree on a 3. And I say, all right, well, what about the impact of them leaving? We all agree that the CEO does have a lot of intimate knowledge about the business and is pretty integral to the business's function. So maybe we say it's a 4. We plot the point. There's the CEO. Well, go back to the question. Which are we more concerned with? The CEO or the intern abruptly leaving the company? Apparently the answer is CEO. And boy, oh boy, it looks like we're touching that red area. That seems like we need to start putting a plan together now about what to do about this. Now we go to mitigate this. And if so, how? How do we approach that? Well, that's the risk treatment. That's a conversation for later. At least at the immediate moment, we know we're more concerned with the CEO than the intern, and we've conducted a qualitative, calculation, which can be fast, doesn't require a tremendous amount of research, pretty easy when determining or calculating for intangible assets, but does require a lot of experience and did not give us even a lick of financial information. This then thereby suggests that there's going to be some sort of system where we do get some financial information that maybe doesn't hinge off of industry experience. There is. It's called quantitative. Quantitative as opposed to quality. Qualitative. Qualitative, all opinion-based. Quality judgment is critical. Here in quantitative, we're counting things. Here, a formula helps us remove opinion and bias from the process to some degree. Industry experience becomes considerably less important. If you can fact check these points, you could be an intern for all I care and come to a pretty reasonable conclusion. The ALE at the end of this formula can be used to be a sort of determine our budget controls, and data that is gathered can be reused later, which is kind of neat, kind of nice. The cons. Well, it's going to be fairly slow. See, gathering information and fact-checking things tends to be pretty time-consuming, all things considered. And determining what is called an asset value is difficult, if not impossible, for intangible assets, like trade secrets. How do I put a value to that? I don't know. What is the value of Coca-Cola's secret recipe? I'm honestly not sure. It may as well be infinite as far as I'm concerned. Because as long as it stays a trade secret, that's still a product that we've got to, control over. And if that goes on for 1,000 years, that's 1,000 years of profit. If that, how do I put a dollar sign to this? I'm not sure. Determining exposure factor, how much of an asset is lost during an attack, or figuring out annual rate of occurrence, frequency, can be challenging or impossible. So, okay, neither system's perfect. Now, this brings me to sort of a masterclass sort of point that doesn't come up in any real courses anywhere, is that there is something called semi-quantitative. A semi-quantitative approach is where you're going to ballpark these difficult to calculate numbers based off of averages and a little bit of opinion. We're finding a nice middle ground between qualitative and quantitative, and it's usually referred to as semi-quantitative. You're going to use the formula, but you're going to ballpark some of the numbers because you can't otherwise fact check them. We'll do a very quick example here. Which two assets below need risk mitigation first. There's a server, let's say Training Camp owns a server cluster worth $10,000, and based off of past incidents, we expect 1/5 of the cluster to be destroyed whenever there's a powerful storm. We got 3 powerful storms per year. There happens to be a Training Camp office, a new branch office worth $1 million. It's not true, but let's say it is. The town it is in is known to have floods, and a flood is expected to damage 10% of the building. Scientists calculate 1 flood every 50 years. We're trying to figure out which of these needs mitigation first, so we start plugging things into the formula. The exposure factor, or EF, is how much of an asset is lost whenever there's like an attack. We're going to end up multiplying that against the asset value, how much something is worth. When you multiply those together, you get a single loss expectancy. This is how much money you lose every time an attack happens. It's effectively your impact. Now, you could say that's the first part of the equation because that just gets us to impact. The last part of the equation, we need to take the impact and consider the annual rate of occurrence, our likelihood. When we multiply our SLE times our ARO, we are able to calculate ALE, our annual loss expectancy, which for all intents and purposes is our risk value. It's also how much money we're losing per year every time something bad happens. Or rather, no, just how much money we lose per year on average. That's a better way to phrase it. So with our server, we seem to be losing 1/5 of the servers every time there's a powerful storm. So I'm going to say 20%, is the exposure factor. The office, 10%, significantly less. Significantly less. Only 10% of the building is lost when there's a flood. We multiply these against our assets values, 10,000 and $1 million respectively, and we are able to calculate that our average single loss expectancy here, whenever our servers are struck by lightning, apparently is like $2,000. Well, with the office, it's 100,000. Again, at first glance here, I'd say, those floods are a bigger problem. They cost me more money. Except, what is that frequency? What is that likelihood? What is our annual rate of occurrence? That's very important to this overall process. When you bring in annual rate of occurrence, 3 powerful storms per year would give me an annual rate of occurrence of about 300%. 3 powerful storms per year, meaning the servers seem to be getting hit by lightning, I guess, quite frequently, which is pretty unfortunate. God, it feels like there's something we got to do about that. Office, 1 flood every 50 years is the same as 2 every 100. This is a 2% chance. We factor in this likelihood, we will get an annual loss expectancy of $6,000 for the servers. We're losing $6,000 a year on those servers. That is more than half their value, which is ridiculous, and seems like something that could be easily mitigated. Underneath that, we've got 2,000 annual loss expectancy for the office. Because the floods aren't happening constantly. We're looking at like 2,000 a year. All right, now which one needs mitigation first? Servers, obviously. The servers need attention first. They're costing us more money. And hey, whatever solution we come up with should probably cost less than $6,000. So we're sure to get a return on our security investment, a return on our ROSI. So, all right, let's think about this. This brings us to the last part of this chapter. Transference and mitigation. Now there is acceptance, there is avoidance. We're not going to worry about those at the immediate moment. We're going to approach this topic as it exists. With those servers, I honestly feel like there's something we could do about this. Like, I don't know that I need someone else to do something about this. I think I could do something about this. I'm going to mitigate. I feel like with these servers here, all we need is some shielding. We need some surge protection, some spike protection. We need some electrical system here to protect the servers from damage. Maybe an uninterrupted power supply with a high level of shielding. Let's say for the sake of this argument, I am mitigating. I am doing something about it. I spend $2,000 on a really, I don't know why I write 2,000K, that'd be way more. I spend $2,000 on getting a really good shielding for these servers. All right. And that makes it so that we don't lose that money anymore. Maybe the annual loss expectancy now, after my shielding is in place, is, let's say, $1, Bob. Just $1. There's still a residual risk here. We're still losing $1. There's still a chance that our shielding fails and or there is some damages here somehow, somewhere. But like for the most part, I spent $2,000 to try and save us $5,999. I spent less than I was potentially losing. I'm getting one hell of a good return on investment. You can see other situations where it will be even more exaggerated. Spend $6,000, save $1 million. That's great. And that's the goal here. Yeah, maybe lightning rod, maybe. There's a whole lot of good choices. There's a whole lot of options here. And as long as I spend less than $6,000, you'll be able to very clearly demonstrate a return on investment. And that should be our goal. Try to aim for a solution that costs less than we're losing. But hey, look at that. We got some financial information here. That ALE helped become like a way to budget for controls, which I like. Now, what about our office here? I don't know about you, but stopping a flood that happens once every 50 years, like, I don't know, installing like giant walls or something, seems insane. Like, I don't know, this feels like insurance territory, right? So for this, I'm going transference. Transference is we're making it someone else's problem. We're going to make someone else, raise the building, probably too expensive. Move may also be too expensive. Options, though, most certainly. I'm going to say consider all the options for sure. Assuming those options, though, are off the table because moving puts us in a place where we can no longer do the business we're looking to do and or might be cost prohibitive. Raising up the building and or erecting walls to stop the flood or whatever, changing the physical landscape might not be an option. Financially, if somebody says, oh yeah, we can do that, $400 million, you're going to be like, no. So with that in mind, then, probably insurance territory. And flood insurance is a very common thing. It should not be very hard to find that. Now, what I'm looking for is a flood insurance that costs me $2,000 or less per year. Let's imagine I can get for $2,000 per year flood insurance that gives me, let's say, $250,000 worth of coverage. That'd be pretty good, man. Because for the cost of what we're expecting annually, for that cost, which is going to happen if we stay here, we're getting more protection, than we're expecting to lose. So thereby, almost in its weird sense, flood happens, you might have even made a little money. Not expecting that to actually pan out, but in most cases, I want more coverage than I'm expecting to lose. As I don't know, costs change and there's always unforeseen circumstances. But like, it feels like a transference thing to me. What's important to recognize, though, that's very true, Michael. Insurance might get costly. Yeah, it's not gonna be a perfect solution, but it might be an option. If you can't find one that's within the proper scope of the budget, then you practice other options. Or you say to yourself, maybe this is an acceptable risk. If we're not expecting to be here for many years, maybe it's acceptable as it is. Or alternatively, maybe we say, all right, listen, we'll put $2,000 away. We put $2,000 away every year. And when it floods, we've got money in the bank that covers a good chunk of it. That may also be a way to go. Just good budgeting might be a solution around this. But we do want to investigate the risk transference for a second. Cannot transfer the ultimate responsibility, aka accountability here, or ultimately accountability of a risk. Meaning, getting like cyber insurance doesn't mean that you're not going to have PR damage because of the breach. It doesn't mean that, or having insurance doesn't mean you're not expected to do something about the potential of a breach. Well, I have insurance, so I shouldn't encrypt things. Well, if HIPAA says you got to encrypt things, you still got to encrypt them. So like you're not transferring accountability of a risk. You can make someone else responsible for it, I suppose. You can hire a third party. You can transfer to a cloud provider. You can get insurance. But true accountability will always lie with the business itself and is not something that can be transferred. And the same thing goes here for like brand image. We're really only transferring our financial risk. And again, in those cases here, we're doing insurance or outsourcing. And insurance can be obtained for any one of a number of things. But like, it's a stopgap. It pays us some money, but like, there's brand image, there's, the negative publicity that comes with this. People might cancel their contracts later, and none of that's factored in to the transference 99.9% of the time, nor does the law in a lot of cases like view this as a clear demonstration of due care. So what I guess I'm saying here is in the end, I feel like there's an over reliance on risk transference and a misunderstanding of ultimately what that insurance offers us. It's only going to give us money. It's not going to bring people back to life. It's not going to, help our image. Yeah. And well, it's limited. So an over reliance on it is definitely happening out there in the world. And we want to be cognitive of that. We need to be knowledgeable of that. Now, of course, then I guess there's mitigation, things we do. We take it upon ourselves to solve a problem. This is a more clear demonstration of due care that we are attempting to fix something. And we're deploying safeguards and countermeasures, be they logical, be they physical, be they directives, be they detective controls, be they compensation. I'm not worried about that at the moment. Lots of choices, though. The point being is that in mitigation, we are doing something. And when we demonstrate that, when we do something, we are demonstrating that we care. And that's what a lot of people want to see. That's going to help our image better. Demonstrate that we're doing something about it. Of course, you could always mix them. You can use transference and mitigation together. As a general rule, though, never spend more on mitigation than an asset is worth to the business. In the end, though, our risk management is an ongoing process. We have to constantly be looking for changes to impact and likelihood, SLE and ARO. We have to look at the treatments and make sure they are still remaining effective against threats new and old. We'll have to monitor our people for their currency of skills, as is a challenge in and of itself. And be on the lookouts, for maybe new treatments and new solutions. As again, this process is going to be ongoing. It's a never-ending cycle. Some key takeaways, though, or key points from this section. An infinite number of risks exist in the world. We need to do a little triage and find the biggest. That's the whole point of doing an assessment. Figure out what is the biggest problem, put that fire out first, then move on to the next. The risk landscape, all the threats to our organization, is constantly changing, so this process will never be able to end. And never spend more on an asset than it is worth. All right. With that said, we'll go ahead and take a quick little break here. If there's anything you'd like to add or discuss in the interim, you're welcome to do so. Otherwise, we'll take a quick little break, come back, and then talk about our other two sections, as well as a couple case studies therein, now that we've got some of this under our belt and be ready to have some of those discussions. Although I get the vibe that you're a pretty sharp bunch here, so I think you'll be able to solve these problems pretty quickly. So let's go ahead and we'll take just a 5 here. If you need to run to the restroom, grab a drink, stretch your legs. Now sounds like a good as time as any. Not that you couldn't have been doing that before, for all I know. But I'll give you a second here. If there's anything you'd like to discuss or talk about in the interim, I'll be present. stretch my legs for just a second here, and we'll get us back to it. All right, folks, we're going to speak a little on ethics here for a few minutes and then touch on how the legal side of things is, well, not just something we need to be aware about, but something that might be applying some level of complication to this overall process that some businesses are having a little trouble navigating. Our third module here, professional ethics and legal requirements. The ISC2 or ISC squared Code of Ethics. They say in their forward, the safety and welfare of society and the common good, duty to our principles and to each other, require that we adhere to and be seen adhering to the highest ethical standards of behavior. Okay. They then go on to elaborate, and they say, all right, you got to protect society. Yeah, it's a pretty good policy statement, all things considered, isn't it? Yeah. Did they get into the details up there with that sort of forward, with that policy statement? No, they didn't, They just made it clear that ethics is important to them. They then later elaborate. They want us to protect society. They basically telling us safety comes first. We should be discouraging unsafe practices. They want us to also promote prudent application of security measures, and doubly so when safety is part of it. That makes good sense to me. I don't know about you. It's safety first. Easy to fix a computer, much harder to put a person back together. Harder to fix. So safety first, protect society. They then go on to say we should act honorably. We should be telling the truth. We should be honest. We should observe and uphold our contracts and agreements. Seems reasonable. Now, what I think is kind of interesting about that is that I view that there's a little bit of a hierarchy to this whole thing. I don't know that this was intentional on their front, and no one at ISC2 was able to can really confirm this. But I think to myself, putting safety at the forefront here, even above, in some cases, maybe the law, maybe above some of these other things, is kind of interesting. We got to be doing what's right by society before we get worried about those other things, the contracts and so forth. Just because a contract says push somebody into a meat grinder, which is kind of a gruesome thought, but just because a contract says that doesn't mean I should do it. the safety comes first. They then later elaborate, hey, we want to protect our principles, as in we should be actively attempting to avoid conflicts of interest with maybe businesses that shouldn't be trusted, things of that nature. We should be cognizant too of like our own conflicts of interest. Like, hey, boss, I can't do that. I shouldn't be auditing that project because I worked on that project. And we should be going out of our way to make sure that we're avoiding those. And respect authority, respect the policies, respect those, those rules that have been laid out for us, as anyone should, I think. Protect the profession, sort of at the very, very bottom. As in to say, in a sense, the job comes last. The business's profits and our careers come last. We may also view this as avoid association with unethical businesses and individuals. We may also view this as maintain our competence, make sure that we're undergoing some form of continuous training and or awareness so that we're keeping aware of the latest threats. Someone who had security training 20 years ago, as far as I'm concerned, has none at all. Maintain our own competence, protect ourselves. But also, again, that comes long after the safety. The business's profits, perhaps, and our own competence and our own advancement in our profession, which we need to do, doesn't come before the safety, doesn't come before, telling the truth, doesn't come before the law, which is interesting. So businesses, maybe, or CEO who says, hey, sign this document for us. All right. Yeah, I know that's not how much money we made last year, but sign it anyway and file it away. It'd be like, no, I'm not doing that. And I refuse. Oh, that might not be good for your career. Yeah. All right, fine. And then there are whistleblower, things out there. I'd turn that kind of thing in. We just can't be having that. And we can't be having people threaten us either. This is our code of ethics, that we should be trying to adhere to. All right. So do care. Do care. You've heard me mention this multiple times, is integral to this entire discussion. It's critical to security as the public and the courts are looking for it. And it's about doing what is right, within the scope of reasonable expectations. Or in other words, it's acting ethically, it's following those ethical, guidelines, even if it gets in the way of the profits. It's also about avoiding negligence and making a good faith effort to keep up with that ever-evolving world. That's all the due care. And we need to be in a constant state of demonstrating that as security professionals. But then due diligence comes up all the time when talking about due care. I mean, they go hand in hand. Due diligence can be viewed as providing a record of compliance or a record of policy enforcement. It could also be viewed as ensuring due care is being practiced throughout the business, or even just the process of like making sure I'm doing my own due care. Like I know I need to do due care on this project. I need to make sure that I am thorough here and making sure this project stays ethical and secure throughout. But like, I'm going to forget. So as part of due diligence, maybe I make some reminders for myself later. So how do we deal with older systems, end of life systems that are still controlling critical infrastructure? Well, from a due care perspective, we just have to, one, we're going to try and change them if we can. But assuming we can't change them out, assuming they cannot be replaced, they cannot be upgraded, they cannot be removed. And certainly the control system of the power plant don't work without it. And turning that off would cause more death and destruction than anything else. I'm thinking like, all right, how would I do care here in this instance? I would air gap that system. I would compensate like crazy. I would erect defenses around said system. If it's incapable of protecting itself, deploy defenses around it, So, we don't, a system itself might not be able to defend itself, but that doesn't mean we can't hire a bunch of bodyguards that can. Interesting approach there, Todd. Due care as thinking and planning, as due diligence as action and implementing. Um, I would say that I've definitely seen that used in some places as in such a fashion. I would say that ISC2 tends not to. I think they tend to look more at due care as the actions you are performing, and due diligence about making sure that there is record of that due care, and or investigation of due care is due diligence. But for example, um, people are following the policies at work. They're performing due care. I'm making sure they're following them. I'm doing due diligence. Due diligence is about making sure the due care is being performed. Um, so thereby, in a sense, is an action in of itself. But due diligence ends up being more about like providing record, providing auditable materials relative to the due care. Well, the due care itself tends to be more of just the hands-on actions that people should be performing when they're following the policies. Now, the real reality of it is outside of ISC2, people will use them mostly interchangeably, and that's where we land on it. But we want to acknowledge that these are going to be critical, right? And here's my takeaway. You got to demonstrate you're making an effort. A good faith, ethical effort to security is what we're looking for. And that's what they're going to look for in a lot of the legal senses. They're going to be looking for your meeting requirements, but they also want proof you're meeting the requirements. They need that due diligence. They're going to be checking, doing their own due diligence upon us. So we're going to do some due care. We're going to make sure we're meeting the requirements, if not surpassing them, if ethics dictates the need for it. As long as you, though, are demonstrating an effort, it'll be a slap on the wrist as opposed to them seizing and shutting down a company with a myriad of fines. Demonstrate we're moving forward, perform that due care. We see there's a bunch of privacy regulations out there that are ever evolving. And this is one of our biggest challenges right now for businesses. And I've had a lot of people tell me, oh, my business doesn't have anything about privacy going on. Does your business have employees? Yeah. Do you have a database of employee phone numbers, addresses? Do you have a database that contains those employees' social security numbers? They're like, yeah, that's privacy stuff, man. Now, we might not have a privacy law on the federal level of the United States, which means if you're like me and you're on the northeast of the United States, for the most part, I'll be super worried about it. But these regulations do protect citizens from those places as they travel abroad. So if I have somebody working here that's also a citizen of South Korea, HIPAA applies to them. If I've got a citizen or somebody here is a dual citizen, or maybe somebody who's traveling and they're only here for like 6 months, but they're technically a citizen of California, CCPA protects them even abroad, which honestly means at that point, since these protect people, even when they're traveling, you're going to just have to assume that everybody's is protected by a privacy regulation. And to that end, then, though, this is an ethical thing. Protecting people's identities, protecting data subjects, is something that should be done on the sake of ethics. So, a business might want to collect lots of people's data to improve itself, to improve it to meeting its goals, but we really shouldn't be doing any of that at the detriment of the people, of the employees, the contractors, the data subjects, the customers. So, we can achieve our goals while keeping their data secure. And leaking that data is going to subject perhaps these, customers to identity fraud, various forms of crimes, and so forth. No need to put people in jeopardy like that. No reason to raise the risks of my customers and or employees just for profit's sake. So, ethically speaking, I think upholding these privacy things is necessary. And since they protect people even when they're traveling, you may as well just assume everybody's covered under one of them somewhere. And if you just follow them then kind of across the board, that'll actually cost you less in the long run. Because honestly, to follow the rules of these systems, even if you get outside of ethics, it cost my company 10 grand or 20 grand or 100 grand a year to maintain compliance. Yeah, but a single breach will cost you 30 times, 40 times, 100 times that. Most of these things fine based off of percentages of a business's gross incomes. They'll hit you for 4%, 7% of your total earnings. That could very well be, yeah, or usually 2 million of your currency, or 20 million of your currency, whichever is greater. Like that could be so much more. So in most cases, financially also makes sense just to follow these. And I'll leave this topic with, hey, there's a bunch of privacy regulations floating around at the moment. We're going to touch on some vocabulary from them, but awareness of them and the need to follow them from an ethical point of view is what needed to be kind of hammered home at this point. And they're spreading. It started with GDPR and it has spread. And we've been finding them all over the place. Japan, Australia, New Zealand. There's many more than I've listed here. Now, on a federal level in the US, we do have one, a privacy regulation, but this is not just for general privacy. This is specifically for protected health information or personal health information, specifically for medical records. We're talking about HIPAA. So that again, basically most privacy is spreading, as it probably should. Financial. Okay, on the more money-related side of things, there's Sarbanes-Oxley, there's GLBA, there's PCI DSS. Interesting note about that. PCI DSS is technically the only one I'm going to have on this screen that is not actually a law, rather a standard/contract enforced by the credit card companies themselves. Now, what I can say about these, though, is that for the most part, these guys here on the left are heavily focused on confidentiality. For the most part, these financial ones are focused on integrity and preventing fraud. But like still, things that need to be followed. And again, if they're not followed, people are doing jail time and or the company is getting fined. And in most instances, more money than if you were just stayed in compliance. You know, in most cases, staying in compliance costs us less than the fines. We may as well just build the security in and be in compliant at the get-go. Government, we got FedRAMP, which is about cloud requirements. We got FISMA, Federal Information Security Management Act, CGIS, GSC, the list goes on. I could list out hundreds, if not thousands, of government regulatory requirements. Now, of course, some of these are very, very specific. Like FedRAMP only matters if you're like a defense contractor or you're part of the US government and you're using a cloud system. Otherwise, it probably doesn't come up. Which I guess brings me to this point to wrap up this point of discussion. We got to figure out what laws would be relevant to our business. And in like the scope of like CISSP, I'm not expected to be a master of each and every one of these laws because again, there's tens of thousands of them. What I'm expected to be able to recognize is that as a security professional, I have to figure out what ones will be relevant to my business and then familiarize myself with those. Much like the frameworks, I need to know they're out there and that I need to care about them. And when I find out, oh yeah, great, we've got privacy data. Now I need to be figuring out, okay, which of these privacy regulations should I be concerned with? Some terms, though, that we'll see, especially when it comes to the privacy ones, but these terms are also used quite frequently in the banking and the financial ones as well. A data subject. The person, said datas are related to. If you're talking about like privacy, this would be like the person who the PII, personally identifiable information, is related to. Now, in most of the privacy regulations, got to give consent. Consent must be given before anyone's allowed to collect information about you. And who's going to collect that consent? A data controller. A data controller is going to collect consent, from a data subject before data is collected. They will also be held accountable for making sure the data is properly classified and marked as PII, personally identifiable information, or PHI, medical records, or even in the scope of like the banking stuff, PCI, payment card industry data. It needs to be classified, it needs to be marked. It's up to the controller who gathers the consent to make sure things are marked at the time of collection/creation. All right. When we talk, though, about that consent, which has to be gathered at the beginning by that controller, The controller is also responsible for outlining how the data will be used and its intent, like how it will be processed. Am I collecting this information for marketing's sake? Am I collecting this information to share with a third party? And if there are third parties, aka data processors, who the hell are they? All that needs to be outlined. So, data subject, you or me, the customer, right? If we're going to give our data to a company, that company's got to get consent. Whoever is gathering the consent becomes the controller. And from a legal standpoint, they will be held accountable if anything goes wrong with this collected data. That includes even if the controller shares this data with a third party, as outlined in the contract, and the third party has a breach, controller's fault. They're on the hook for this. They are legally required to be responsible, may I say accountable, for anything that goes on here, which means if a controller is going to share data with somebody, not only does it have to be outlined inside of any form of consent document, but the controller needs to be doing their own due care and due diligence upon anyone they share the data with. I famously once had somebody say to me, no, listen, once we share data with them, we don't care because if it gets breached, it's on them. And I went, who got the consent form, them or you? And, well, we did. Well, then it's on you. If you share something with them and they get breached, it's going to be your butt in the courtroom. Well, I'll sue them later. Well, you can go ahead and do that later, but that's not going to stop the court from dragging your name through the mud. Your business is the one that got the consent forms. Your business is accountable. Your business is on the hook for this. Well, I guess I better make sure the processor's handling things correctly. Ah, indeed. Indeed. A controller has the responsibility, needs to make sure that anyone they share that data with, processors, are properly handling the data and keeping it secure, because again, it's their butt if anything goes wrong. An access use policy, that could definitely be a way of authorizing someone to have access to something. Acceptable use policy, similarly. What I would prefer, though, to see between a controller and a processor, for the sake of making sure the controller's got that has clearly expressed to a processor, someone they've shared the data with, expectations, is what was usually called a privacy level agreement, a PLA. That's the terminology they like to use on the legal side. Let me know if that successfully answers your question or not, Joe. But like, all right, as a recap here, as we move forward, the data subject, person who has their data collected, and even in a banking system, you're going to end up with your name stored somewhere and maybe your address and your social security number. That's data subject. That's the people. The controller is whoever got consent to collect that, and they're going to be legally on the hook for making sure it stays secure, even if they share it with someone. The data processor becomes anyone that the controller has shared stuff with. They process data in accordance to the policies and procedures outlined by the controller. Where would we outline these policies and procedures? Privacy level agreements. Cloud providers sort of made that a boilerplate process for any time that somebody's like, hey, hey, Amazon, I want my company to use your servers in the blah, 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 blah cloud system. They're like, you want to use AWS? Cool. Here's a PLA alongside your service level agreement. Just to make it clear, they're like, here's what we're willing to do. And by the way, if you want something outside of that, you pay extra. But like a privacy level agreement, right? Outlines what the processor, someone holding that data on behalf of the controller, is going to do. They are expected, though, in the scope of the law, to alert the controller in the event of a breach. It's ultimately the controller's job, though, to alert the authorities. Agreed. Yeah. Data processing agreement is another one that I see quite frequently. Yep. DPA. Yep. It could be part of a master service agreement or other general contract. Agreed completely, Alex. Absolutely. Now, we then see mention of what is called a data protection officer. Sometimes people call this a data privacy officer. someone there who is supposed to be an expert on this law, or at least familiar with it enough, but definitely an expert when it comes to security. Um, they're going to try and work for the processor and or the controller, to help not only maintain compliance, but also keep a data of all the privacy information that's held, and where are those consent forms, eh? Got to have a data protection officer according to GDPR and a handful of the privacy, regulations. And that could just be a system admin who's wearing an extra hat one day a week while they keep all this properly collated. I imagine for larger businesses that will turn into a full-time job of several people. But all things considered, somebody has to have that like nameplate on their desk. Somebody who's going to be there responsible for making sure we stay compliant with the privacy regulations. A couple of honorable mentions here in the back end of this section. The Wassenaar Arrangement. The Wassenaar Arrangement, an arms control treaty signed by 40 plus nations that pertains to dual use technologies. Like, a rifle might be used in time of war, but also for hunting. It's got dual use, military and domestic. We see this pop up in IT world because of encryption tools. Some forms of encryption, notably things that support large encryption keys. Oh, the Wassenaar Arrangement has something to say about that. Now, that is not to say I can't make a piece of software. Here's a piece of software that uses, let's say, AES 128. It doesn't mean I can't sell it to some other country. But if I am going to be trading softwares that support that type of encryption from one country to the next, I got to go through the proper channels per the Wassenaar Arrangement, according to this arms control treaty. So you can still do things. You just got to go through certain channels, fill out certain pieces of paperwork. Otherwise, you're going to end up in legal hot water. And that's not the only export law that's out there, but that's the most common one when it comes up to talking about IT security. What about PCI DSS? You mentioned that guy briefly earlier. Probably the only one out of the entire list so far that wasn't really a law. This is a contractual standard enforced by the credit card companies who are behaving and acting as controllers. Why? Well, you see, the banks hate fraud. Banks don't like money getting stolen one bit, and neither do the people nor the governments. So in the end, banks basically dictated that Visa, MasterCard, Amex, we're going to have to act as data controllers, and we're going to be on the hook for anything that goes wrong with the credit card system. Well, those controllers, Visa, MasterCard, etc., decide that anybody who's going to store credit card information, anybody who's going to be able to transmit credit card information, anyone who's going to be able to process credit card information like PayPal and Venmo, we're going to become data processors. And a data processor would have to sign and follow this contract before they were allowed to store, transmit, and process credit card information. Of course, the goal here, though, since it's financial sector, is to reduce fraud and promote integrity. These contracts are regularly updated as far as their requirements by the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council. And there are multiple different levels, 4 different levels. One is like the highest, and they have the most requirements. 4 is the lowest level, where they do less than 20,000 transactions a year, so they have the least requirements. But ultimately speaking, a tiered system where the more transactions you make, the higher the requirements for how you're going to promote integrity. And failure to uphold this contract as a processor, as PayPal and Venmo are, will lead to pretty hefty fines, much like a privacy regulation would. So while it might not be a regulation, the banks and the credit card companies are effectively enforcing this, and they'll fine you, in accordance with the contract for failing to follow it. Which just brings us to the point of, if you're going to get involved in storing, transmitting, or processing credit card information, PCI DSS becomes something we need to be aware of. And awareness is what we need here, because we need to know, oh, the CEO's planning on doing this. All right, we need to warn them that PCI DSS is a thing, and then we should probably get out there and take some classes about PCI DSS. Bringing me to this point. A security professional will need to be aware of regulatory requirements that are relative to their organization's business. Now, can't be aware of all the regulations because there's far too many of them and they change basically constantly. So regulations and best practices are constantly changing. So you'll never know all of them. Just have an awareness of them, and then, dig into them as needed. And regular consultations with legal teams will be needed, as even if you become an expert of HIPAA and they update it, or you're an expert on PCI DSS and they update it, you need to figure out what changed and how that relates to your business. Ultimately, though, as security professionals, security managers, we're going to be trusted advisors to the rest of senior management, like the CEO and so forth, who will undoubtedly forget PCI DSS exists, who will constantly forget that privacy exists, privacy regulations, and we'll have to remind them of those regulations and suggest how we can meet them in terms of our IT function, which will mean being creative, ultimately speaking. Anywhere we can, though, provide documentary information regarding regulations and best practices, to fellow management, we should. It'll help, spread awareness, which, if we go back to the beginning of our ethics discussion, I feel like is advancing the profession. Share that knowledge, let people know those privacy regulations are out there, those credit card regulations are out there. Spread that knowledge, share documentation where possible. Right? That's not something we want to be gatekeeping here. That's going to lead big problems later. That brings us to our fourth section. And then we get to do a couple case studies as we start wrapping things up for the day. There'll be a chance for questions or any discussion you'd like at the end of, as I mentioned before, business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning. Touch briefly on the essentials of a business continuity plan and disaster recovery plan. Mention some things about impact analysis and overall strategy development. Okay. We're going to also talk about recovery strategies like alt sites and the importance of test planning. So let's go ahead and do it. Business continuity planning. All right. The goal. Boy, I'm going to underline this a couple times here. Let's see. Underline this in green. Proactive, proactive, proactive. You see, disaster recovery plans, we're going to develop them proactively. They're going to be birthed, in most cases, from a business continuity plan. The business continuity plan, builds a disaster recovery plan, I'm hoping, before the building's on fire. Once the building's on fire, then you follow that disaster recovery plan to get the evacuation done, to get the alt site up and running, and all the things that we have to do there. So a disaster recovery plan is like, when you're actually following it, you're in reaction territory. You're actively recovering. Business continuity, though, something you're should be doing beforehand. A proactive endeavor intended to protect critical business functions. Now, risk management tends to look at risks all over the place. Sure, you can focus it in on critical business functions first, but inevitably, risk management ends up panning out, zooming out, and addressing things beyond critical business functions. Business continuity is probably not going to do that very much. They tend to stay zoomed in on what are those critical business functions. And as somebody who once did this, I don't know if this was a famous thing, but I at least feel like it is in my head, famously said to some other people, I'm here to protect critical business functions right now, and I don't give a damn about anything that isn't. So to hell with that projector in that office. It doesn't actually affect the business's goals directly. It's not a critical function. If it stays off for another week, so be it. Do I want them to get another lamp? Yes. But at the moment, I'm in the middle of making sure we have a disaster recovery plan for what I believe is an upcoming pandemic. And it was. And to hell with the projector lamp. That is not a problem. Admittedly, I don't feel like that projector will even matter in 6 months. They're prioritizing here and zooming in on the heart of the business, making sure that thing stays beating. We lose that, none of that stuff matters. We're going to protect critical business functions by building redundancy around those critical systems. We're going to deploy prevention controls in and around said systems, and then we're going to develop those disaster recovery plan or incident response plans to guide the company in the event of an outage. And again, probably to hell with anything that isn't one of the critical functions as far as we're concerned here. Got to keep that, heart beating. So to get this all started, we need a steering committee. They may go by other names. I don't care what the name of it is. I once decided that we were just going to call it the BCP team. And that's fine. A steering committee, though. The goal of the steering committee, right, is to perform a business impact analysis, what we call a BIA. And then after that, off of that, develop the various strategies. As in, the business impact analysis will help us decide where we need those prevention controls and what type of prevention controls will be best. The BIA will give us some metrics like recovery time objective to help us, figure out what are acceptable recovery times for disaster recovery plan and incident response plan. But we're not going to be in a good place to develop any form of plan, strategy, or proactive defense measure without knowing what potential impact we're dealing with. So a steering committee needs to do a BIA, business impact analysis. And in the end, what they're going to do is they're going to look at those critical systems and they're going to say, how long could we survive without that critical system? And that will get the ball rolling. More on that in a moment. This steering committee must include key stakeholders from each of the departments. You need someone from IT, you need somebody from HR, you need somebody from marketing, operations, etc., including someone who is an executive with a good understanding of the business objectives and spending authority. Like risk management, you got to have management buy-in. Here, we even need a little bit more. We need management embedded in this process to help guide us and to give us that money. Right? Nothing's free. And to help us decide where we should be spending the money, so like they got to be embedded, they got to be bought into this process, they should be part of it. No steering committee would be complete without someone from upper management. Now, here is one sort of way to look at things. This is a process here that I wouldn't try to memorize the steps. Some places say it's a 6-step process. Some people say it's a 9-step process. Some places say it's a 12-step process. Some places say it's a 3-step process. I don't care about the steps. What I care about is the overall sort of notes that are about like this. Like, first and foremost, if you're going to build that steering committee, right, and you're going to try and do an impact analysis to gather metrics and so forth, one of the first key steps here, I suppose, after having a steering committee, would be to analyze the business and say, what are your critical business functions? Which does mean, what assets do you have? Much like risk management, what are the assets? With the assets, and an understanding of your critical business functions, and honestly, what are the goals of the business, all of that brought to the table now for the steering committee. They can then assess the risks. What would cause an interruption to said functions? And how long could we survive? How long could we survive? It is these first 2 steps that I would say are the business impact analysis in a nutshell. What do we have to lose? What is the most important part of the business? Check. Hey, how long could we survive without those things? And what could happen to them? This business impact analysis should allow us to create some metrics. Metrics like an MTD, also known as the MAD. A maximum tolerable downtime. MTD, also known as a maximum allowable downtime. This is how long we can survive without something that's critical. How long can I go without oxygen? How long can I go without, that heart? How long can we go without those servers? When you've determined those timers, those metrics, that will help fuel the development of a strategy. But you got to be able to, you got to look at those timers. Like, that really affects the strategy. Select the strategy. What preventative controls can we build in? Is there a gap between our current capabilities and our requirements? or expectations. Hey, we might have contracts, service level agreements that say you cannot be offline for more than X number of hours. Like, oh, that might even be less than the MTD. Like, lots of other things might help affect this, but mainly it is those metrics that we determined up top, and we start to put together a bit of a strategy. What preventative controls, what detective controls, what do we need a disaster recovery plan? I bet we do. Develop a plan. You know, there may be instances where you don't feel like you need to, but in a lot of cases, you'll want to have one. Put together a plan. Now, you might have a proactive BCP plan that's about making sure preventative controls are in place, and you'll have a DRP plan, disaster recovery plan, for the reaction. You know, determine if there's a relocation place to go, an alt site. Talk about those in a moment. And then we're going to validate this plan with stakeholders. We're going to get their input. When I say key stakeholders, I mean like maybe a business partner. If this affects them, we might want to get some input from them. The rest of upper management. We built somebody, one of the upper managements, one of the executives into the steering committee, but we're going to want to get that. We're going to want to get this in front of the entire group, maybe even to the board. We want to get as best input as we can on this plan, because this might mean the difference between life or death for the business. If they like the plan, they basically sign it off. You've got management approval. We're going to implement it. We're going to hand out the plan. We deploy this disaster recovery plan or business continuity plan or a combination of both. We get them into people's hands, and then I guess we're going to have to train people on them. We're going to have to test them. We're going to have to rehearse them. A fire drill is absolutely useless if no one's aware that a fire drill or rather like a fire evacuation plan. You got a plan for how to evacuate the building in the event of a fire, but nobody knows of it. It's pointless. Much like a policy that's not enforced or unknown, we got to get this out there. We got to teach people. So we test it. We train people. We find flaws in the plan during our testing. We go back, we redo. We make this as good as possible. Our goal, though, in almost all cases, is our recovery time objective. The expectations outlined in the plan for getting us back on our feet should always be less than or equal to like our maximum tolerable downtimes. As in, a plan should have us recovering in less time than the point where we would otherwise go bankrupt and or fail as an organization, which seems reasonable. But it's always not so easy. You might determine a maximum tolerable downtime of 1 hour. Making a plan that gets you back up and running in less time than that is sometimes challenging. So test and rehearse, enhance it, try things until you find something that feels like it's going to work, and then really hammer that home so you know it will with a high level of confidence. And then, like anything else, rinse and repeat. Maintain the plan. The business will evolve. The plans will have to be revised. Anytime there are changes to the business, revise the plans, retrain, retest. Rinse, repeat. Cyclical, like everything in security, a process that never ends. That also, though, means some level of job security, which isn't a bad thing. So as we said, these first couple steps are really our impact analysis, help us determine those recovery timers. That helps us select a good strategy, put together a good strategy, and overall a written plan that can be handed out. Right? The development of the strategy, though, and the handing out of that plan and the testing of it, that can be a business continuity plan or disaster recovery plan, and that comes after the analysis. The business impact analysis, is the next step after you have a steering committee, sort of the first step in enabling business continuity. Now, this brings me to some points that I don't feel like stressed enough in a lot of courses about this, and something that feels like a great thing to do on our little seminar webinar here today. Hey, when it comes to critical business functions, how do you find those? Like, it's easy to say find what those are, but then always I feel like something that was critical is missed, and that's going to lead to an overall bad plan. So let's find those critical business functions. Well, we should do a vertical analysis. We should go to each of the department leaders in our business units, and say to them, hey, I need you to figure out what are your most critical business assets and list them out in a hierarchical order. And then give me a basic, 1-sentence description of what that offers us. So like, okay, you said server A. What does server A do? I need a one-sentence description. Put this together for me. Prioritize assets within that given department and give that to the steering committee. The steering committee then can look at the assets in each of the departments on what I always picture as a spreadsheet. This is a vertical analysis. You're basically going to the department heads and telling them to report back on what they believe are the most critical things relative to them. And thereby we're getting input from the people who are the most hands-on, which I think is reasonable and a good way to go managerial from a managerial standpoint. How about horizontal analysis though? What business units are the most important to our primary business goals? We're pitting the departments against each other. All right. This is not something you're actually going to get the department heads involved in most cases. Here's what's going to happen. The steering committee is going to talk about which department or business unit is the most critical to the business goals. There may be a pair of them, there may be a trio of them, but chances are there's one or two that are more important than everybody else. When you determine what are the most important departments within the business, the steering committee will bring this to the senior management, the C-suite, as in senior management, like the CEO is going to need to sign off on this and say, yes, no, for sure, that is the most important department. Because what we're going to end up doing, and this may happen as part of a, let's say, a disaster recovery plan, is we might say, oh, the building burned down, cool. When we go to the alt site, we're going to at the alt site, we're going to support 4 out of the 6 departments. Well, what about the other 2? What about them? They're not going to get supported at the alt site because they're not viewed as critical to our goals. They're not important enough to be spun up at the alt site. Well, there's like 100 people that work there. There were 100 people that worked there, unfortunately. We have no need to support that at this point. Moving to the alt site, there is nothing for them to do there. We're going to have to, a capacity plan is going to have to identify here that some folks might need to get laid off. The opposite could also happen. You might end up needing to hire a lot of people on very rapidly at some new location. That is also possible. All things considered, though, we might need to pit departments against each other, and that is a horizontal analysis. So when I say identify critical business functions, I'm talking about things inside of a department. When I'm talking about vertical analysis, when I'm talking about horizontal analysis, I'm actually pitting the departments against each other as well. All in all, though, something that needs to happen in the BIA, I'd like for everything to be sunshine and roses all the time, but sometimes we might have to decide that certain things have to go in the event of a disaster. If we're all basically going to have to put this company on a form of life support because of a disaster, non-essentials have to go. We also need to be cognizant of our supply chain. Supply chain risks are numerous and often overlooked. We need to do an upstream analysis. Who are we relying on? Who are our vendors? Who are our suppliers? Do alternative vendors exist? Are they acceptable? We got to do an upstream analysis. We also have to do a downstream analysis. Who relies on our business? Our customers. Okay. What risks are there for our customers? How do we find new customers if needed? Why does that matter? Well, if your customers are gone, probably so is the business. Think about that. So you're not just concerned with your suppliers, your upstream, you're concerned with your downstream. A disaster could happen to your downstream, and that messes up the whole food chain, man. So like there's a food chain to business. The supply chain is that food chain. Any break in it will affect us and put us maybe in a position too of going out of business. Yeah, COVID did this in a big way. We need to be looking at that upstream and downstream. Which brings me to sort of a weird case study that I'm not formally going to approach entirely, but I'm gonna interject this for a split second here. When a hurricane hit the United States, there were a lot of businesses that had uninterrupted power supplies and generators. Cool, so hurricane hits, the main power from the power plant, trees are falling and stuff, main power's cut. Uninterrupted power supplies kept them up long enough to turn on their diesel generators. The generators start running, keeping the data center alive. Good. And in some cases, that data center was critical for first responders to communicate through. So that data center needed to stay on, even if the feed to the data center was lost. All right. Hey, does a generator run forever? No, it does not, right? So they had contracts in place as part of their, disaster recovery plan slash business continuity. They had contracts in place that said, hey, gasoline or diesel or whatever, every third day, some company is going to come in with a tanker, top off our generators, top off our reserves, so we can run for 4 or 5 days without power. So they had a plan for fuel refills. Yeah, that worked on paper. The states declared state of emergencies and redirected a lot of those fuel tankers to police stations, hospitals, etc., which meant the data centers then weren't getting them. Whip. So this has caused sort of an interesting response in the last few years. A lot of cases now, places are actually going out of state to get those plans. They're doing a geo diversity here. They're getting those, fuel companies that are going to supply them coming from out of state, because the ones in state are probably going to get redirected to, health facilities and or governmental things due to the state of emergency. So they're going outside the state. That's an interesting insight, though, and that also deals with this whole like supply chain issue. Now, disaster recovery, right, outlines how to mitigate to or migrate to an alternative site after a disaster occurs. As a general rule, the most critical business functions, things with our lowest recovery time objective, need to get established first. So the most critical things get started up at your alternative site first when you are doing recovery. We should also have a communications plan factored into this disaster recovery plan that tells people how to contact employees, how to contact the authorities, and so forth as needed. Solar power, yeah, a possible option, although might not get the sun on the day you need it. And that's always a risk of that. And batteries only last so long. Notoriously during most hurricanes, you don't get a tremendous amount of sunlight. Might have cloud cover for several days, so it's always a challenge there. But not an option we would rule out automatically. We will also include within any disaster recovery plan a plan for restoration. However, restoration is not the process of going to the alternative site. Restoration is about going back to the way things used to be. This might not always be possible. If your building fell, the land your building was built on just fell into the ocean, I don't know that you can rebuild there. You're not going to necessarily do restoration at that place, but like restoration might mean rebuilding the building that burnt down and going back. Sort of as a rule then, disaster restoration, a component of a good disaster recovery plan, would outline how to migrate back to an original site from an alternative site. It would clarify what conditions must be present at an original site in order to permit migrating back. Like, is it safe? Has insurance already documented our losses? Has the replacement gear already been delivered? This is the important, though, element of something that I wanted to touch on here in our discussion here today. And yeah, then we're going to touch on these alt sites like our remote data centers. As a general rule, the least critical business functions, things with a high RTO, get established at the main site first, which might seem backwards. Again, when we go from main site to alt site, when we are doing recovery, the most critical things get turned on at the alt site first. But when you are going back home, when you are doing restoration, it's the other way around. The least important things, the least critical business functions, as in things with a high recovery time objective, like things that aren't super important, get set up first at the main site to pave the way. Mission critical things stay at your alt site until they're all that's left. The reason being, if you send people back to home base and then you sent back the most important servers and you find out, oh, home base isn't quite ready, there's a problem, there's a complication, you've now caused a new incident, a new problem, a new interruption to our services and to our business functions. As far as alternate sites go, you've got a handful of choices. Mirrored sites, which could be ready in minutes to hours, usually have full equipment and an almost full copy of the data. Like basically, as the main site, the primary site, changes happen, data is replicated and mirrored, copied to this backup location. So this backup data center would be ready to go in a couple seconds to minutes to maybe an hour, but it's like they've got all the equipment, they got all the data. The problem with that is expensive. It's expensive. It's costly. A hot site would be less expensive. They have all the equipment, but they don't technically have all the data. They might have like updates that are once every few hours, so you're going to lose a little data here. You're going to lose a little bit of data. Our recovery window here, this place would be up and running in hours up to a day. If it takes more than a day to get this alternative location, this other offices, this other data center up and running, it's probably not a hot site, but rather a warm site, which would cost less because it probably doesn't have all the equipment. Here you're looking at backups that could be 4 or 5 days old and equipment that probably is not pre-configured, and you might have to get on the phone and overnight some equipment and then set it up to get it going. But at least you've got a place to go where the power is on and the heat is running. It's a warm site. The last option is a cold site. This might just be an empty warehouse. This place has no equipment whatsoever, probably very little backups, if any. It's basically nothing, but at least you've got a place to meet. This is a lease on an empty warehouse that is otherwise not used. The cheapest of the options, but the longest and hardest to recover to. Multiple choices exist here, thereby, for alternative sites. Which one you choose is all about how, what type of downtime you're willing to accept and how much money you're willing to put towards having an alternative site. Now, a cloud provider, though, could also become kind of a bit of a mirrored site or hot site if the price is right. If all you need to do is host a bunch of servers in order to get work done, because most people work from home, then a mirrored site or hot site seems just fine for your business. And that could be a mirrored or hot site effectively in the cloud. You can get a contract with Google or Amazon or Microsoft and basically build everything inside of their systems, which could be helpful. This brings me, though, to some suggestions about our disaster recovery plan at the tail end of this section. Hey, ensure your alt sites or cloud sites are not likely to get hit by the same disaster. My backup location shouldn't be three blocks down the road, also on the coast. It also needs to be close enough that the employees can get to it if needed, and should contain backups of our data in accordance with our recovery point objectives and our expectations. When issuing copies of any of these disaster recovery plans, we want to collect all the old copies, destroy all but one, which can be archived. Last thing I want to do is have somebody following a disaster recovery plan from 2014 here in 2024, and then going to the wrong place or calling the wrong people. Sounds like a nightmare. Have employees sign for new copies so we have proof they've received them, and mark all the copies clearly so everyone knows which is the most recent. I take to doing a big cover letter, a big one on the front page that just shows the date in gigantic, obnoxious letters. Then review your plans at least once a year at minimum after any changes have been made, and involve management in the process of the review and the test. They might say, oh, I was there last year, I don't need to be there. No, you really do. This isn't just to make sure the test is still good, it's there to improve awareness, even for management. Because the next disaster could be tomorrow. When it comes to testing these plans, I think the easiest of tests is a desk check. Take it to people's desks, give them a copy, give them a checklist, make sure they read through it, note, here's a red highlighter or a red marker, underline or highlight anything that's wrong. You see a wrong name, you see a wrong job title, you should probably use job titles instead of names. See a wrong phone number, highlight it, mark it, etc. Go through the checklist, sign off, you've read through it. What's nice about this is you don't have to get everybody into a single room to do it. You do a tabletop review. Sit everybody down, talk it out. We're not actually doing anything, we're just talking here. We're making sure everybody understands the plan without actually having to do any of the actions. The next one is a structured walkthrough. Walk through the building, talk out the plan, you know, maybe there's some basic steps people can perform. Like, hey, you said you were going to go into the data center and you were going to turn off servers 3, 4, and 5. Could you walk me over there and point out the servers to me? And find out they don't have keys. We're trying to assess effectiveness while identifying critical flaws that would not have happened when everything up here was in the theater of the mind. Although most of it is still theater of the mind because we're not going to get quite hands-on just yet. The next type of test you can do is a simulation. Now we do an actual practice drill. Here we're trying to recover things in a simulated environment. You know, we're trying to load up virtual machines. We're actually loading the backups into a VM. Here we're trying to determine if we can meet our recovery time objective. They might say, oh, that sounds great. I should do that first. You see, tests become more thorough and costly as we work our way down the list. And there are simple problems up here in the desk check that we want to eradicate before we bother putting everybody in a meeting room. And there are problems that can be identified in a tabletop that we want to get rid of before we get to the point of doing a structured walkthrough, which needs to be scheduled and it's going to take a whole afternoon. And we want to get rid of all those problems, the problems found in all three of those, before we dare try to do a simulation. And by the time we're at the simulation, we already know the understanding of the plan is good. The plan seems plausible, seems reasonable. Key flaws have been identified and eliminated. Now we're trying to see, can we meet our recovery time objective? Can we get this system back up in time, you know, to meet management's expectations? If you get that far, in 99% of the cases, you're good, and there's no further need for testing, I think. Having said that, though, sometimes you might find need to do a parallel test where we do an operational test of our alternative site without interrupting the main site. And if that goes well, you might opt to do a full interruption, where you actually shut down the main site and activate the alternative site. Like, this is a simulation to the point of actually causing a real failure, though, at the main site. In a lot of cases thereby, that seems way too risky to me. And I wouldn't do that unless someone mandated I do so, which does happen from time to time. Cool. With that discussion completed, let's look at two quick case studies here as we wrap things up for the day. The Colonial Pipeline attack, right, happened in May 7th, 2021. The Colonial Pipeline, one of the largest refined product pipelines in the US. And an advanced persistent threat group called DarkSide managed to gain access to the company's IT system through an old VPN account. Some 100 gigs of data ended up getting stolen. And then furthermore, the company, or the bad guys rather, DarkSide, deployed ransomware to encrypt everything, kind of shut everything down. This also means that you can't quite see what they were taking. You know, they're stealing data and they're encrypting things at the same time, sort of a multifaceted attack, which is kind of challenging. Now, by the way, to stop the ransomware, the hackers requested 75 Bitcoins, which at the time was like $4.4 million. Woof, that's a lot of money, man. Now, they panicked. They weren't really sure what to do. In this instance, you know, they're like, well, we're getting hit with ransomware. We got a plan for that, but like never to this extreme. And we're also getting data stolen, and we don't even have a plan for what to do there. So they basically shut everything off. Thereby, all fuel transportation was halted as a precaution. Well, now you basically stopped gasoline and fuel from being sent across the country. This is going to cause fuel shortages in a number of states and a tremendous amount of panic buying at the fuel pump. All right. Any suggestions here about maybe something that could be done here to make sure this isn't happening? Look at the root cause is usually where I go with these types of things. Certainly there's a lack of governance, I feel like. There's a little bit of an issue here with technical maintenance. Joe hit the nail on the head almost immediately. That's pretty damn, those are great answers, guys. I love it. One, you need good backups. Why are the backups useful? Well, that's our number one way to thwart ransomware. You got backups. You take the backups, load it over all the encrypted nonsense. You're back to where you were. You didn't lose anything, and now you don't have to pay them millions of dollars. So yeah, backups is a great way to deal with the ransomware. But yeah, let's review the old stale accounts. Let's close the old accounts. I mean, that is how they got in. They got in through an old VPN account. My question is, why is that Active Directory, like allowing an account that's been sitting there for 8 years to still be usable? A script should have been developed, or an admin should have do a review and say, oh, that account's not used anymore. Lock, like shut down unused accounts. I agree completely. Joe and Michael, both great suggestions. But for all that to happen, backups and some sort of business process that involves locking down accounts, even in a logical sense, we got to start with better policy that dictates those things. Those types of actions should become a regular practice here at the business, which they weren't. So it starts with a breakdown of governance that leads to a lack of good defenses. I agree completely with both of those. Research from expert teams, including the federal government themselves, like their incident response team or emergency response team, issued the following solutions, which are all in keeping with the suggestions here. Shut down unused accounts. Obviously, that would have stopped it entirely from even happening in the first place. An anomaly detection system monitoring inactive accounts could have also been an early warning. Apparently, that inactive VPN account had been used weeks prior for, footprinting and so forth. If they had gotten in a little, if they had noticed that account was being used by some unknown party and had been sitting basically unused for years and years and years, an alert message to an admin should have, been, oh, something is wrong. There's an account I should have had locked. Oh, I should have done something. No, they had no such detection whatsoever. Better investigation / analysis could have kept parts of the pipeline running. I'm going to be honest, they panicked and they shut everything off, which I don't know that was actually necessary. A better incident response plan here could have kept most of that pipeline up and running, as most of it wasn't actually the target. Like they were losing their logging servers, which I feel like, yeah, that's a problem. But like, I don't know that we had to have the pipeline off for as long as they did. So better process there. And hey, you know what? I think Joe's got that nice, insightful thing. Backups. I think that would have also been very helpful here with our recovery. How about another situation? SolarWinds compromise. I saw this one coming a mile away and was not loud enough about it. And I'm kind of mad at myself about that. In 2020, SolarWinds Orion software was compromised. This attack seems to be from Nobelium, according to Microsoft, but we don't actually know how true that may or may not be. Like, it's kind of hard to be sure. An advanced persistent threat, Nobelium, performed this supply chain attack where they targeted SolarWinds Orion software. Now, SolarWinds wasn't the target, though. That's why this is a supply chain attack. The target was the customers who use the SolarWinds system. This led to over 30,000 public and private organizations that use that software getting compromised and having tremendous amounts of sensitive data being, I said infiltrated, should be exfiltrated. That's what I get for typing too quickly. It auto-corrected to the wrong word. Exfiltrated. Now, this complicated attack, though, didn't start in 2020. It started way, way sooner. This complicated attack began back in 2019 when the threat actors gained unauthorized access to the SolarWinds update servers, the servers that pushed out the updates for the Orion software. And a root case analysis of like, how they gain access to that. One of the servers had the password SolarWinds123 set by an intern about 6 years prior. Like many years prior, an intern set the password for one of the main update systems to SolarWinds123. This password got leaked to the dark web long before this happened. People in the dark web already knew the password was SolarWinds123, meaning the bad guys already knew it. And supposedly, somebody had sent in a message to the company like, hey, by the way, did you know one of the passwords for your servers is like being leaked to the internet? No action was taken. The password sat like that for a long time until FireEye noticed something was wrong with the Orion software. And we're talking, again, 30,000 plus systems getting all their data stolen. The impact, massive. I can't even quantify it. This may be one of the largest hacks that ever happened. Could be, can't be sure. Yikes. Multiple levels here, multiple facets. I feel like, though, so much of this would have been stopped if we had just handled that server in the first place. Number one, why is it an intern who's setting a password on a mission critical server? Why is that password being left forever? And I mean, we don't have to change passwords every month or even every year, but come on, shouldn't we be changing that a little bit more frequently? Especially after it's been published to the dark web and somebody submit a ticket that says your passwords have been leaked. How come that wasn't changed? On top of all that, though, what a terrible password. Even if someone hadn't leaked it to the internet, what a just absolute bad password. The name of the company, 123. I like the suggestions I'm already seeing. Policies should have prevented this entirely. A good password policy, first off, should say you're not using the name of the company, 123. Policy should dictate maybe that important servers have, I don't know, multi-factor. Yeah, people leave the company, passwords should change. Procedures are important. Joe, I agree completely. Yeah, this is just a bunch of botched governance in the grand scheme of things. Password policies should have been set up front. Administrative policies, like company-wide decrees about how policies should be or passwords should be handled. And then logical rules should have been made in group policy to dictate, passwords maybe on this server needed to be changed, or they can't contain the company's name, or weak policy is where this all started. Important servers should probably be protected more than a password. Come on, right? PAM software, privileged access management software, can limit and monitor admin accounts, up to and including forcing the admin account passwords to be changed and all of the use of said accounts to be audited, which they weren't using, which you would expect considering they make software that does that. FIM, File Integrity Monitor, can detect file changes. They were checking, by the way, before patches went out, they would check the hashes of the patches. But the way they were kind of storing the hashes is they would just copy the hash and put it in a Word document, a text document elsewhere, and then later compare. Now, I don't know that that's 100% true because admittedly, I'm reading articles on articles, investigative articles online, but I would hope that they were using or perhaps could use a more advanced form of checking for the patches that are about to go out so that when someone tampers with them, we have a better chance of catching it because apparently hashing didn't cut it. Maybe signatures. Maybe all the patches need to be signed by a specific workstation that is air gapped. I can think of file integrity management practices that could have detected the tampering of the patches that went out that ended up containing the malware beyond just hashes. And I think that would be good. All things considered in the end, I think it started with some bad management up top. They'll do better, and I bet their security is probably pretty damn good at this point. I think a lot of companies have to have something like this to help wake them up, and remind them as to the importance of security. So I bet their security now is probably better than anybody else's, or it's up there. At least that'd be my hope. They're tricky. I hope we can learn from these things. Um, you know. So with that said, a couple last minute notes. Hey, everyone is responsible for security, but it starts with management. Management buy-in is required for the success of any project, and we'll never be able to eliminate all the risk. There's always going to be a risk. We should not ignore any risks. All things are considered, and we remember that every day will be different as risks and our risk, profile is always changing. Risk management, an unending cycle. You know, people say safety comes first. I think that it works with on an ethical level, and the ethics always come before the business. Now, I should note that good training does lead to an increase in reported incidents. That makes some people think that somehow the business has become less secure over time. I don't think that's the case. I think we end up being more aware of the issues, much like sometimes folks will say the world is more violent than it ever has been before. I don't know that that's necessarily true. I think our awareness of problems, thanks to the internet, and our ability to communicate has enhanced. So our awareness of social injustices and various problems and wars and so forth that are going on is just heightened, which is not a bad thing. Remember that if it can't be measured, it cannot be managed. Things need to be measured. We need to be able to, see a return on investment. We have to be able to confirm a system is working, or else we can't be sure that it's secure. When we design our security in up front and we start with good governance, it will be cheaper and easier. Build that security system in, build that fire suppression in, as opposed to, I don't know, having to rebuild the building later after it burns down. Training and documentation are key to conveying policy and procedure, as it will create a culture of awareness. And hopefully that training will give us some time to explain why this security is important, as I think only in the end, once people understand why, will they respect the security itself. And I think people will struggle between convenience and security all the time. Hey, that's fair. Sometimes security feels like a chore. But if we know why it's there and we know the risks and we can learn from other people's examples, we'll be going into a better place. We'll be moving forward. As we said earlier today, if you're not growing, if you're not moving forward, you're dying. All right, folks, I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. And I'm going to be here to talk about anything you'd like to ask or discuss. But thanks for spending the day with me. It was great. Here, if there's anything I can help with, if you'd like to talk about CISSP or preparing for it or anything of the sort, know that my door is open. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'm glad to hear it. That's very cool. Yeah, step
Hey,
three is, go ahead.
oh, I'm sorry, my audio cut out. Did I interrupt someone?
No, you're good.
Oh, I was just gonna ask, were you going to email a copy of the presentation
I
or
believe
the
I'm
recording?
planning on uploading it to the internet at some point in the near future.
Okay, so we'll probably see an email if we register for the session after?
I would imagine so. I was
Okay.
told that was going to be something that my boss was going to take care of.
Okay.
I need just make sure that I am making a presentation.
No, fair enough. I just thought I'd ask before I signed off again. Thanks.
You're quite welcome.
Bye.
See an email about 2 weeks. Yeah, that sounds about right. That sounds about right. I can't personally speak to any of that, but I think that's the intent anyway. You're welcome, Joe. You're very welcome. And to those all studying for CISSP, best of luck. Keep it up. I think though some of the concepts from today though are some of the harder points to gather. I feel like um, the under the recognition that governance and like due care is like so critical to demonstrate you're like making an effort. And then to try and reconcile that with the business's profits and how they need to look out for themselves while being cognizant of all those ethics and regulations. Um, is a challenge, um, especially for some of us like myself who initially started perhaps in the IT world in a more technical sense. Getting into the management mindset, I guess is my point, is sometimes a little challenging. But I think if you go into this test remembering that it is a management test first, and that you got to look at it from that governance point of view, um, and that you recognize, yeah, it's going to be a struggle to balance, the security with the business's needs. Like, going in, that is the battle that this test is like sort of trying to make us aware of. Um, you'll be in a much better place. So, in short, this is a management test, a governance test, not a technical test. Careful not to get lost in the weeds, folks. I've seen some people who have studied and they're like, okay, I know how to subnet now. And I'm like, that's cool as hell, man. There's nothing about subnetting in this test. So don't get lost in the technical stuff. Remember, management, management, management. Like the technical stuff is going to come up a little bit, here and there, but it's like not the main focus of it. It's like tertiary details in a story that don't really affect most of it. You're welcome. Have a great weekend as well. I wish you all the best weekend possible. Agreed, Joe. Agreed. All right. I'm going to start powering stuff down here, but let me know if you got any things that I can assist you with. If I don't hear from you in a few minutes, I'll probably start, I'll probably power stuff down. So, but here to help if I can. Let me know.